Hello and welcome to Question and Answer, episode 6,452,319,312,467. And I'm just kind of amazed that we're getting up into such high numbers with these, but we just keep going. Just keep pounding away at this, answering questions until all questions are going to be answered, which is probably never going to happen. When I first started doing these, I figured, well, after 50 or so of these, people will run out of questions. But the thing is, more people are starting to watch these and more people are asking questions because they don't bother. They just cannot find the time somehow to watch all of the previous Q&As to see if their question has already been answered. And before I start answering this longish, not as long as last time list of questions, I do have an announcement to make. I am thrilled to announce that I'm going to get some micro and myofauna to inject into my new aquarium. After going out looking for unpolluted ponds or streams that had a lot of like derbis at the bottom, couldn't find it. I went to various places. I mean, it's got to be out there somewhere, but I haven't found it. So I actually kind of wimped out and ordered it. And this is just going to be totally deluxe. In addition to several species of tree leaves that are waterlogged, those leaves are cultured with all kinds of stuff like gammarid amphipods, benthic copepods, beneficial nematodes, gastrotrix, maybe even tardigrades, rotifers, and a variety of ciliate protozoans. And I know what you're thinking. Panyo, how can you inoculate your aquarium with gammarid amphipods? Don't you know that they're considered to be a pest by many aquarium keepers? Well, I just tell you to just kind of mind your own business because there is a method to my madness. And I'm going for like an ecologically diverse, balanced ecosystem in that aquarium. Also, I'm taking the plunge in a radical fashion and getting some hornwort. And I know what you're thinking, Panyo, how can you put hornwort in there? Don't you know that it's a column feeder? But yeah, just mind your own business. I know what I'm doing here. And I do have 3 snails now. 3, which isn't a very high number, but what can you do? And their names are Righteous Fist of Apocalyptic Chaos, Righteous Fist of Maniacal Fury, and Leroy Jenkins. So with that as an introduction that has nothing to do with the question I'm about to answer, or at least attempt to answer, I'm going to commence to attempting to answer questions. And this first question is from Saint Sword. Again, I mean, he's never really specified the correct way of pronouncing his name, whether it's Saint's Word or Saint Sword. And Saint Sword just seems more natural, so I assume that that's what it is. And so, with beverage in hand, I'm going to answer this question. And the question is, American culture is already hostile to Buddhist practice and values. What do you say to Christian nationalists, or even more reasonable, atheistic people like my brother who advocate for this hardline return to Christianity? Well, first I'd like to address this first statement that he makes, that American culture is already hostile to Buddhist practice and values. Not entirely. I mean, Buddhism, some sort of Buddhism anyway, is in fashion among sort of the anti-religionists. They don't see Buddhism as a religion. You know, certainly there's not a whole lot of faith involved. In fact, there's so little faith involved for these people that they can just change Theravada Buddhism to suit themselves. You know, like I've said before, there are some of these people that are actually agitating or advocating to change the 4 Noble Truths. Because the second Noble Truth says all suffering is caused by clinging and attachment or craving. And they're saying, no, not all suffering is caused by craving and attachment. Some suffering is caused by patriarchal oppression. But even so, I mean, Buddhism, American culture is not really hostile to Buddhism, as far as I know. I mean, just Like traditional morality in general, yeah, because like sensual overindulgence and so forth, pretty much all major religions frown upon that. And I mean, that's just been pretty much dismissed from the entire equation of morality in Western civilization. But let's just get to the question, shall we? And the question is, what do you say to Christian nationalists, or even more reasonable, atheistic people like my brother who advocate for this hardline return to Christianity? Well, I don't think it's extremely reasonable for an atheist to advocate for a hardline return to Christianity, like Christian nationalism. I mean, it reminds me of Ivan Karamazov and the brothers Karamazov, who also, he was an atheist, but he wrote some article for a newspaper or some such advocating for the importance of the culture being strongly Christian, because he just likes what it does to society, even though he doesn't believe in it. And I mean, it just seems strange to me. I've never really been able to relate to like endorsing something that you think is false. So anyways, getting back to this question a little more firmly, if you will, what do you say to Christian nationalists, or even more reasonable atheistic people like my brother who advocate for this hardline return to Christianity? Well, I mean, I really can't advocate for a hardline return to Christianity because I'm not a Christian. I couldn't really be a Christian because I just don't believe the story, the narrative that you pretty much have to believe. You know, that there was this man named Jesus who was the only begotten Son of God Almighty, who died for our sins. You know, he is our Savior. And I just do not and just cannot believe it. It's just not really a viable option for me. It just doesn't resonate with me at all. And it's just sort of cynical and borderline, at least dishonest, to go along with it when you don't believe it, you know, to advocate for it when you don't think that it's true. So what do I say to Christian nationalists? I mean, they're free to advocate for a return to Christianity. I assume, I mean, I have been willing in the past, you know, just considering all the options and so forth. I think I would be willing to take the hit and have my own religion be downplayed or even persecuted to some degree for the sake of Western civilization or American society sort of unifying under Christianity like they did before, which would strengthen the country and give it sort of, it would sort of resuscitate Western civilization. It might be sort of a shot in the arm, so to speak, using a little bit of medical jargon there. I almost said the wrong thing that could get me in trouble. Use the V word. But yeah, it could strengthen society. I agree with that. Although personally, I couldn't really become a Christian. And I mean, if they really went like Spanish Inquisition mode, you know, persecuting non-Christians and so forth, I mean, I might have to just take one for the team and get like burned at the stake or something. I don't know. But I certainly wouldn't want to pretend that I'm a Christian when I'm not a Christian. I mean, I can advocate for a kind of liberal Christianity. You know, like the people I work with, they know that I used to be a Buddhist monk. They're cool with it. You know, it's just so long as you do your job, as long as you're not making trouble, we got no problem with that. So, you know, no problem. That kind of Christianity is fine. And I think America would be better off if not only were more people believing Christians, because traditionally, historically, Western civilization has been predominantly Christian. But, I mean, it would have to be like a conservative, traditionalist kind of Christianity, not rainbow flag Christianity. And with rainbow flag just indicating, like representing an entire spectrum of just nutty leftist ideologies. Which includes, like I was saying earlier with regard to Theravada Buddhists, just changing whatever you don't like and like queering the religion, among other things. So what would I say to them? Well, I mean, more power to you. Just don't persecute the non-Christians. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sigālovāda. And Sigālovāda, he has dedicated all three of his questions to the peculiar subject of Willy Wonka. So, question 1 is Willy Wonka a metaphor for Mara? And then he gives some evidence for this, which is represented by a wealthy global elite, sells a highly addictive substance across the world. Was that just chocolate or some kind of candy, I guess? Well known to everyone, regardless of age or social class. Well, Mara is not well known to everyone. Can travel anywhere and knows everything about the winners of the golden tickets before they even meet. Well, first of all, the idea that Willy Wonka is a metaphor for Mara is unlikely, considering that whoever wrote the original story about Willy Wonka and the chocolate factory probably was not a Buddhist, probably did not know who Mara was. So, I mean, you could say, well, is he Satan? Does Willy Wonka represent Satan? And I just don't think so. I mean, it can happen occasionally. You've got somebody who writes a children's book and puts in some kind of dark kind of innuendo, symbolism kind of stuff for the adults to pick up on. But I don't know why they would do this. I mean, Willy Wonka, it seems to me that like children's literature has a lot of sort of folklorish, mythological themes to it. You know, like read like the old fashioned kind of fairy tales, and they're called fairy tales because there's like a certain amount of the paranormal involved, witches and fairies and, you know, all kinds of things. So Willy Wonka, he seems to me more like Santa Claus, where he does have certain powers, you know, and he can seem kind of, he's got like a dark side, like Santa Claus. He'll give lumps of coal to the naughty kids instead of giving them the nice present that they want, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think Willy Wonka would be more of a metaphor for some sort of like a small g god, like Santa Claus. I mean, Santa Claus really is kind of deified in a like a pagan kind of a sense. So I think Willy Wonka might kind of be along those lines. He's sort of like a new variant on the general Santa Claus, Father Christmas kind of theme. Although he's less limited because he's less seasonal. You know, it's not just a Christmas thing. So the highly addictive substance, I mean, kids like it. They don't see it as highly addictive, I guess. A wealthy global elite. I really didn't realize. I mean, I saw the movie a long time ago, the first one with Gene Wilder in it. I didn't know he was a wealthy global elite. I mean, he's sort of like a reclusive, eccentric millionaire or billionaire nowadays due to inflation. So can travel anywhere. Yeah, Santa Claus can do that. Knows everything about the winners of the golden tickets before they even meet. Yeah, he probably does have a certain amount of like psychic powers or something. You know, he's magic. See, he's this magical man. So I'm just going to move on to Sigālovāda's second question, after probably answering, you know, probably not with regard to, is Willy Wonka a metaphor for Mara? I don't think he's a metaphor for Satan either. You know, he's obviously more good than bad. If you just go, like, if you watch the movie from a kid's point of view, you know, he has sort of like this tough, dark side at first because it kind of keeps the audience in suspense. And then he comes out as the good guy at the end, which, you know, he always was. You know, it's just kind of typical of sort of folklorish attempts at telling a story that would be suitable for a young audience. So anyways, Sigālovāda's second question, does Willy Wonka's factory reside in hell? And then he's got evidence for this too. Factory is larger on the inside than the outside. The winners were ferried into the factory down a river. Cryptically mentions the uncertainty of the destination and the fires of hell. Various stages of the factory reflect each winner's desires. Each winner meets a gruesome fate, which should be fatal unless it's hell. The workers of the factory look quite demonic. Well, that's kind of ableist or something, I think. Sizist. See, the workers break out gleefully into song after each incident. Yeah, they're like the chorus in like a Greek tragedy or something. An entire song complete with choreography they knew. Yeah, they knew in advance. They practiced this. The workers were originally from an African pygmy tribe. I didn't know that. Oompa Loompas were from, they're African pygmies? Huh. That's an interesting theory. And then finally, cannibalism was a common practice among such tribes and may have been implied when a worker was described as appearing to be made of chocolate. Yeah, there was the other kid that swole up into a big blueberry too. But considering my answer to the first of these questions by Sculadin or Sculadine, I do not think Willy Wonka's factory does reside in hell. I mean, there could be, there's sort of like some dark, sort of to maintain suspense and a certain amount of like not knowing exactly what side of the fence Willy is actually on. And then at the end, of course, he turns out to be a good guy. But I mean, it creates suspense when you're in doubt at first. And so they might throw in some kind of dark symbolism to make you suspect, well, maybe Willy's not what he's passing himself off to be. Know what I'm saying? So let's see. Factory is larger on the inside than the outside. I mean, that's not necessarily peculiar to hell. I mean, that's just paranormal. That's magic. So again, Willy Wonka is like this magical being. And some magical beings, they got their light side and their dark side. Elves, for example, they don't just help Santa Claus making toys. Elves can do all kinds of things. They can like snatch babies and like curse your cattle and so forth. So let's see. The winners were ferried into the factory down a river. That could be some of that kind of dark symbolism that's meant to like create a certain suspense in the viewer to make them ambivalent, unsure of like what kind of a guy Willy Wonka actually is. Cryptically mentions the uncertainty of their destination in the fires of hell. Okay. Various stages of the factory reflect each winner's desires. Well, I mean, that's just convenient for the telling of the story or the making of the movie, I think. Each winner met a gruesome fate, which should be fatal. Well, I mean, in a way, that's kind of symbolism of a lot of little kids' stories from the past, or in little kids' poetry, where naughty kids are going to have bad things happen to them. The goblins are going to get you. So, it's in a way, it's kind of a moral story where the kids that obviously are bad kids in one way or another, it catches up to them. So that's like karma. Okay, the workers in the factory look quite demonic. Again, that's ableist and sizist and probably a bunch of other things that are not fashionable nowadays. See, the workers break out into gleeful song after each incident. It's a musical. They got to sing about something. What are they going to sing about? Stirring chocolate? See, an entire song complete with choreography. Yeah. See, it's a musical. I mean, the Munchkins on The Wizard of Oz, they're all choreographed too. They're supposed to appear spontaneous, however, because they're inspired. The workers were originally from an African pygmy tribe. I'm not even going there. And I really don't think that there's like symbolic cannibalism involved in this. And at the end, it's like, you've got this ambivalent, dark, sort of ambivalent symbolism where you're not exactly sure whether Willy's a good guy or not. And that at the end, he turns out to be a great guy. And then he appoints the kid whose name I don't remember to be like his successor. So yeah, Charlie, he's got it here in the next question. Assuming the role of devil's advocate, that Willy Wonka is Mara and the factory is in hell, then what exactly happened to Charlie? Well, I mean, first of all, if Mara doesn't live in hell, Mara lives in a high heaven realm. The Buddhist devil, he's actually in the highest heaven realm in the Kamaloka, or the sensual world. That all the heaven realms above the level of Mara are no longer sensually oriented. So this is kind of a mixed symbolism here, whereas Mara wouldn't be in hell anyway. He'd be in heaven with his 3 voluptuous daughters, and who knows who else. So let's see, what exactly happened to Charlie? Well, I mean, going with the symbolism of Sculadin here, then yeah, Charlie would have become the next Mara, I guess. But I think it's kind of pushing it. It's sort of stretching things to say that Willy Wonka really does represent Mara or Lucifer or, you know, some demonic supervillain. And yeah, I don't think that the chocolate factory is in hell. So yeah, I think it just goes with, like, who was that guy back in like the 70s and 80s who wrote about just the universal, almost like the Jungian archetypes of like folklore, and you know how even Star Wars fits in. You know, you got the young innocent boy who must prove his manhood and his worth, and you know, sort of fulfill himself by going through these harrowing ordeals and all this. I can't remember his name. Joseph Campbell, I think was his name. I mean, Joseph Campbell could explain Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory perfectly satisfactorily, I am sure. And there was too many syllables in that word. So, due to the slight trauma from saying a word with too many syllables, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mary J. And this is kind of a follow-up question to the previous Q&A, like an answer I gave in the previous Q&A, because otherwise I don't know what he's referring to. And Mary J says, what would be the deeper method then? So I assume there was a question about like the Goenka method or something, or the Mahasi method, where I was saying it is a limited method. So after you get a certain amount of progress, a certain amount of advancement, then you'd probably do well to move on to a deeper method. You know, that some methods are limited. And, you know, once you get to the max of that method, then it's a good idea to switch to a different method. Or if for whatever reason you just can't make any more progress in it, then it might be a good idea to try a different method. So what would the deeper method be then? With regard to mindfulness, I think was the context of this question. Then, I mean, it's like, the deeper you get in meditation, the less busy work your mind is doing, the less thinking you're doing, the less perceiving you're doing, the less focusing on objects you're doing. The more advanced you get with mindfulness or any kind of meditation, really, the more kind of relaxed and just lucid your mind is. That it becomes like what J. Krishnamurti called choiceless awareness, where you're just aware of whatever is there, but you're not focusing on it at the expense of everything else. If you focus on one thing, you perceive one thing, then everything else just becomes background. But what you want is your focus to be sort of like on a cheap plastic camera where everything is equally in focus, or like a mirror where everything is equally in focus and you're not singling out anything. It's all just there in crystal clarity. And that would be the perfection of mindfulness if you can perfect that. And according to the text, the perfection of mindfulness is also fourth jhana, so it's like a twofer. You get 2 for 1. Perfect mindfulness, fourth jhana. So, yeah, the deeper the method, the less busy work your mind is doing. But you can't just dive into the deeper stuff before you're ready for it, because your mind has to be busy. Like, if you're not really adept at meditating, then your mind's just going to be overflowing the bounds of the meditation method. You're just going to be sitting there for half an hour or so, just thinking about food or girls or playing music in your head or whatever. So you have to calibrate your meditation method with how like agitated or active your mind is. If you've got an active mind, you have to have an active meditation method, because if you don't, if you've got an active mind and an inactive meditation, sort of a still meditation method, then your mind's just going to overflow and just be going all over the place. It won't stay within the bounds of the meditation because the meditation isn't giving it enough to do. Your mind has to be occupied with your meditation. On the other hand, if you've made progress and you're able to do a more still, quiet kind of meditation, and you just keep grinding away at the ABCs, you're not going to make much progress with that either. So, Let's see, where was I? What's the question? What's the damn it question here? What would the deeper method, what would be the deeper method then? So, it's like ultimately you'd be doing what the Roman Catholic contemplatives called contemplation, where you're just not thinking anything and your mind is clear, like the pane of glass or the mirror or the cheap camera or whatever. But you have to sort of calibrate where you are at with the appropriate level of busyness of the meditation method. The actual meditation method might not be all that important. You could be counting your breaths or doing a mantra or visualizing or whatever it is, like in the elementary levels. And then as your mind gets more and more still, then you kind of make less and less work for your mind actually to do the thinking, perceiving aspect of your mind. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to Mary J's next question, which is, any thoughts on Gnostic teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas? Well, I have read the Gospel of Thomas more than once. It has been a long time, though, probably at least 20 years since I've read the Gospel according to Thomas. And I've read some stuff about the Gospel of Thomas, too, that it may be older than the Gospel according to John. At least parts of it are older, because if I remember correctly, the Gospel of Thomas does contain quotes from the Sermon on the Mount. So it does contain certain sayings of Jesus that are contained in the older synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And see, Matthew and Luke are largely based on Mark. So there is that. But it's really hard to say on how authentic the entire gospel is, whether Jesus really did say this kind of secret esoteric stuff. Because the gospel according to Thomas is just sayings of Jesus. There's almost no narrative at all that I'm aware of. It's just a collection of sayings of Jesus, sort of like a Christian Dhammapada or something. And it's really hard to say exactly. It might be impossible to say how much of this really was taught by Jesus and then got lost when it went mainstream and kind of normies took over, or how much of it just got added by Gnostic sects or, some esoteric sect of Christianity that wanted to make the teachings of Jesus more metaphysical, kind of, if you know what I'm saying. And I really can't say which it is. Did Jesus really teach this stuff? That's not, some of it probably does include genuine teachings of Jesus that just weren't included in the other gospels, like the four biblical gospels. But it's hard to say, it's maybe impossible to say exactly where to draw the line between Jesus really taught this and some of this got lost, when Christianity went mainstream and was taken over by normies, or Jesus didn't really say it, and it just got put into his mouth by Christian Mahayana Buddhists or something, who are inventing new kind of deeper, more metaphysical teachings and then putting them into the mouth of Jesus. I really can't say which it is. But the Gospel according to Thomas, I would much prefer if the Gospel according to Thomas were included in the New Testament instead of the Gospel according to John. I really don't have much use for the Gospel according to John, except for the beginning and the end, how Jesus became a high profile teacher and got his first apostles. That part of John may actually be more accurate than the first three Gospels. The first three Gospels, Jesus is just walking along and he sees some fishermen and just calls them, come follow me. And then they just drop their nets and take off following Jesus. Whereas according to John, the implication is that his first apostles were, for the most part, already apostles of John. And then when Jesus became John's successor after John was arrested, then, they just became his followers. And then also the trial and execution of Jesus might be more accurate in John, but the Gospel of Thomas doesn't talk about any of this, because, as I say, it's just a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. So those are my thoughts, I guess. And you might not know any more now than you did before I gave my thoughts. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, please talk about satire as a medium that does tell the truth. I find meaning of life very insightful. Absurdist comedy is liberating. And then by meaning of life, I assume he's referring to Monty Python and the meaning of life. So please talk about satire as a medium that does tell the truth. Well, I mean, it is a palatable way of getting social commentary into the minds of people, at least at a subconscious level. You know, if you're just like ranting against something, then it'll turn a lot of people off. You know, they'll just tune you out or whatever. But if you put it into an entertaining kind of a story where it's just kind of hinted at again and again, it would be much more acceptable. And if it's like humor too, then it kind of puts people into a good mood. And when you're in a good mood, you're more receptive to new ideas. If you're in a bad mood, it's just like, fuck off, leave me alone kind of a thing. But if you're in a good mood, you know, you're happy, like comedy can do to people, then it makes you more receptive to these ideas about how society is all messed up. You know, like a good satire would be the first RoboCop movie. That was a lot of social satire. Even the movie, the first, what was it called? Rollerball movie with James Caan. That was satire. I had to watch that in a high school class as an example of satire. And yeah, I mean, it's good. Most normies aren't going to really pick up on it. It could plant a few seeds at a subconscious level, but symbolism usually for the average person watching a movie is just like whoosh, just right over the head. I mean, I've known people, intelligent people with university degrees who could read Lord of the Flies and be completely clueless that the whole thing is an allegory. The entire thing from start to finish is symbolic. You know, it's not kids on an island. It's human beings on planet Earth, just for starters. So, yeah, I think satire, I do like satire. Like probably the first philosophical story or work that I ever read was Micromegas by Voltaire. And Voltaire was a satirist. And I do appreciate that. I can pick up a lot from that kind of thing. But generally it's like I'm understanding what is being symbolized and agreeing with what the person's saying anyway. But for the average person, I don't think they're going to get much out of it. Just saying. But with regard to Monty Python movies, I much prefer their first movie, which is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. That's definitely in my top 3 movies of all time. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Yuga-U's next question, which is, do you have a favorite Monty Python sketch? And I don't know if I have like one single favorite Monty Python sketch. I've got several, I guess. The fish slapping dance is classic. The dead parrot sketch is classic. In Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the whole prolonged scene with Tim the Enchanter is just classic. Or also Dennis, the socialist peasant. The whole scene with Dennis that's excellent. But I've got lots of favorite Monty Python sketches. I kind of grew up with Monty Python, which some of you may not be surprised by. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And as is occasionally the case with Fred, I do not fully understand where he's getting at with this question. But yeah, maybe I do. Do precepts have any metaphysical gain? So do you gain metaphysically through keeping precepts? I assume is what he's asking here. And I mean, just the precept itself, you know, I undertake the precept to abstain from onslaught on living beings, for example. Just the precept itself is just ethically neutral and you could say metaphysically neutral. But if you do live a moral life, then it's sort of like the door is opening to the potential of metaphysical gains. That like a saint is much more likely to be exposed to the paranormal in a conscious way than the average sinner, using Christian jargon. So precepts, do they have any metaphysical gain? They set you up for metaphysical gain. They can prepare you for metaphysical gain. I guess at the karmic level, yeah, I mean, everything is metaphysical to some degree. Karma, I guess, could be considered metaphysical. So when you stop, or when you reduce your unwholesome karma and increase your wholesome karma, that in and of itself would be a metaphysical gain. Ultimately, though, as I keep saying, that karma and metaphysical gains in general are mental and not physical. They're not just outward mechanical stuff. So just outwardly, mechanically not drinking alcohol, for example, I mean, that's just morally neutral, really. It's the associated mental states. And it's the associated mental states that condition whether you're going to make metaphysical gains or not. Because metaphysical gains are going to be mental, not so much physical. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving right on to Fred's second question, which is, in my opinion, what the Buddha taught is very simple and has been ravaged by papancha, or diversification. For example, Mahayana. To me, he went to a forest, cleared up his life circumstances, and turned away from the world. The question is, did he really stop rebirth? Considering we still have desire for warmth and food, etc., how can one have an emotional clean sheet with lots of past memories? Well, that's a good question. And the thing is, even a Buddha is still human. Even a Buddha is going to have like the amygdala in his brain that condition anger, for example. I think if somebody gets their amygdala taken out, they become just embarrassingly affectionate. I read a psychology book talking about a girl who had just furious bouts of rage. She was just smashing stuff. And so this was like the glory days of experimental brain surgery. And so they just took out the amygdala, and they didn't explain in detail the situation, but it did say that she just became embarrassingly affectionate. So I guess you have to look that one up in a different book, I guess. Let's see. Did the Buddha really stop rebirth, considering we still have desire for warmth and food, etc.? Well, one question that the Buddha absolutely refused to answer is, what happens to a Tathagata, or Buddha, after death? What happens to an enlightened being after death? He wouldn't answer it. But I guess the answer to the unanswerable question is along the lines of the fact that an enlightened being is no longer identified with this natural empirical world. He doesn't identify with it anymore. It can still keep happening. You know, nature keeps running its course, but an enlightened being is detached from it. He's no longer identified with it, that it's just nature taking its course and it's not him. So because a Buddha is human, he may still have desire for warmth and food, etc., but it's not him. It's just nature taking its course. He is detached from that. So the complete detachment, I assume, would be complete enlightenment. And it doesn't mean that the thoughts don't continue to arise. You know, it's like I've considered that becoming enlightened is like being cured of obsessive compulsive disorder, where the obsessive thoughts and impulses will continue to arise. It's just that if you're cured of it, you learn to detach, not identify with it, and not act upon it. So it just arises, it's just nature taking its course. And the cured person with OCD, it never completely goes away because it's largely genetic. It's like it's according to science, there's this built-in glitch in the brain that won't allow you to shift gears, so to speak. The caudate nucleus and the cingulate gyrus and some other obscure center in your brain. They form a kind of short circuit and you can't get out of it. It just keeps cycling. So you just kind of detach from it. It's like, that's not me, that's the OCD. And then you just go and bake some cookies or whatever it is that you do. And you just don't act upon it. So I assume that being enlightened can be that way, at least in some cases, where the thoughts, the desire, the preference for comfort continues to arise, even in an enlightened being, hypothetically. But the enlightened being, it's not them anymore. It's just like weather outside the window. It just really does not have like any kind of internal effect. It's all just external stuff going on, and they're just watching it go by without attachment, not identifying with any of it. It's nature taking its course. So let's see. How can one have an emotional clean sheet with lots of past memories? Again, you just detach from it. The memories can still arise. You just do not react. It's just goes in one side of the brain, goes out the other side of the brain. It's like clouds blowing by across the sky. And with that, I'm going to move on to the next question from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, considering that some saints and mystics are just bound for enlightenment, why would a bodhisattva vow be any different than, say, religious dogma in inhibiting enlightenment? The reason I ask is that the chanting in a bodhisattva vow were what opened me up to Theravada Buddhism and to experiencing many novel spiritual phenomena, so I really don't see them as unenlightening. Well, I think that taking a bodhisattva vow where you pretty much, you're vowing to liberate all beings before you become liberated, which I don't see how that's going to work. But it's like you're postponing enlightenment for the sake of helping all beings. So I think the main inhibition would be in someone who takes their bodhisattva vow seriously, that, they're going to be putting on the brakes to becoming enlightened. They're going to be saying, no, I don't want that. I'm going to do something else, so that would inhibit them from becoming enlightened because they are deliberately avoiding becoming enlightened. But I assume that would happen only at really high levels. You get to a high enough level of spiritual advancement where, enlightenment is available to you, and you're just saying, nope, I'm not going to do it because I took this vow and I'm going to liberate all beings, even though all beings don't really exist and there's always going to be an infinite number of them. So, you can just sort of get tangled up in your own promises, I guess, would be the main way that a bodhisattva vow would inhibit enlightenment. So let's see. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam's next question, which is, would you consider disease to be causal such that it can effectively be undone as easily as it's acquired? Ultimately, yeah, it would be it could effectively be undone as easily as it's acquired by Jesus or somebody who similarly is able to heal somebody. They could heal you more easily than you got sick in some cases. They just put your hands on you, be well, or just be well and go your way and sin no more. And the person's well. It may have been a long, complicated process of catching leprosy or whatever it is. And then boom, they're all better. Or, nowadays with modern medicine, taking a pill that cures you of a disease could be as easy as coming down with the disease in the first place. So, disease is causal, obviously. And it could ultimately, in many cases it already can, and potentially it can be undone as easily as it's acquired. Just ask Mary Baker Eddy, wherever she happens to be right now. Heaven, maybe. So, yeah, I don't think that something causal has to be undone as easily as it's done. Yeah, I think like putting some things together is easier than taking them back apart again. Then again, some things are the other way around. Like back in the old days when people used roadmaps, it was way easier to unfold the roadmap than it is to fold it back together again. Taking stuff out of an envelope can be a lot easier than putting it back into that same envelope. But I'm just kind of babbling at this point. Let's see. So I guess I'll just move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb's third question. And this is, he included this in the Q&A section of the Discord server, but there's no question mark at all. In fact, all he's doing is just quoting me, a statement that I made in the Discord server. And that is, quote, "The idea that a Buddha is selectively omniscient is an orthodox position, though I think the difference between a Buddha and an ordinary arahant, despite the fact that a Buddha starts the system going, is a later artifact." So somebody was asking about, if the Buddha really is omniscient, then how can he get things wrong? Which, he just goes with, ancient Indian cosmology and so forth. And somebody asked a question in the previous Q&A that may have started this little ball rolling about how can an omniscient being like the Buddha just say things that are just empirically wrong, that science, it doesn't agree with science at all. So let's see here. What's the question again? Oh yeah, there is no question. The idea that a Buddha is selectively omniscient is an orthodox position. Yeah, it could just be the idea that the Buddha could know anything that he wanted to know, that he could speak fluent Swahili if he wanted to. He could know the cube root of 56 if he wanted to. That could be like subsequent glorification of the Buddha. I'm not at all certain that the Buddha would be able to speak fluent Swahili or know the cube root of 56 just by directing his mind in that direction. I am not at all certain of that. He may come up with really amazing stuff that no ordinary person might be able to know, like a lot of sages and meditation masters can do. But the whole selective omniscience thing, I think, could be just glorification of the Buddha by subsequent, devotionalistic monks. And furthermore, like I answered it in the question last time, science is not ultimate truth. People think that if you're an enlightened being, you'd have to be in agreement with science. But science is delusional. At least, scientific method isn't delusional because it's not really adopting a metaphysical position. But scientific realism is delusional. The idea that science explains reality is one of the biggest handicaps to Western Buddhists that I can think of. So, if all this is Maya, if this world is generated by ignorance and delusion, that it is an illusion, why would an enlightened being know all the minute details, especially if there's an infinite number of variations on the same samsara, the same cosmos? The main thing for an enlightened being to know is ultimate reality, which isn't like this. There's no fish tanks in ultimate reality, no doorways, no beverages, and no laws of physics. It's just like this infinite formless consciousness, if you want to call it something. But calling it anything is futile because labels don't stick to it. And anything you can really say about it is ultimately invalid. So I guess, considering that there wasn't even a question mark in this, you just wanted a little bit of elaboration, I guess. So I elaborated a little bit. And now I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Sigālovāda and Sipad Zidana. And Sigālovāda and Sipad Zidana says, what is the left-hand path and what are your thoughts on it? Well, the left-hand path mainly rejects traditional morality. And it rejects it outwardly more than inwardly. Like the whole idea of Tantra is that we're now living in the Kali Yuga. We're living in a spiritual dark age, and that perfecting yourself, becoming a perfected saint, just isn't realistic anymore. And so you have to take sort of the degeneracy of the world as it is and transmute that into like higher consciousness. And so like in Indian Tantra, they would ritually do the 5 M's. I think it was meat or mamsa, fish or matcha. Let's see, was it sex or maituna? No pun intended there. Let's see. There was majja or like alcohol. And then there was another one that they'd pretty much lost. That it has been lost. Sort of like the actual ingredients of soma in the Rig Veda. It's this 5th M. Probably it was some kind of drug, but it's like they've lost the actual meaning of this 5th M that is ritually participated in. And so they just replaced it with parched grain, which I don't know why parched grain would be all that like immoral or anything at a superficial level even. So they do this, they take these things and they do it as mindfully as they can. So what they're trying to do is like live maybe an outwardly immoral lifestyle while at the same time being mindful and detached and trying not to get messed up by it. And usually they fail because it is dangerous. You're literally, you're figuratively playing with fire by doing this kind of stuff. I mean, to some people that are living in the world, they got family, they got a significant other. They might have duties where they have to do things that are unskillful, unwholesome. That's the best you can do. Or like if you're a soldier or something, then you just remain mindful. Try to keep your mind as pure as you can while doing the impure stuff outwardly. That's essentially the left-hand path. And my thoughts on it are pretty much what I've just said. I mean, for somebody who can renounce the world, you're better off, having as pure of morals as you can manage. If you're living in the world, you're going to have to make compromises. If your kid has lice in his hair, then it's your duty to kill those lice. Even though it's something unskillful, you have a duty as a parent to keep your child healthy and clean. I have to admit, I killed a fish a couple weeks ago. I had 9 cherry barbs in there. A little school of cherry barbs. Very nice. I like them. And then one of the females started getting like these patches of fungus covering her eyes and she wasn't eating. And I didn't want all of them to get sick. So I took her out and put her like in quarantine in just a jar of water. The next day, she wasn't doing well at all. And so she got culled just because I didn't want the entire aquarium to get sick. So, you live in the world, you got to do this kind of stuff sometimes. And so the left-hand path may be unavoidable to some degree. Just try to keep your mind as pure as you can, even though what you're doing outwardly may seem impure. Still be mindful and detached as much as you can manage. Have like metta and compassion for the little fish that's dying, that kind of thing. So I guess I'll just move on to Siovaktion Sipad Zirino's second question, which is one of his trademark long quotes asking me to comment on it. And he says, in Samyutta Nikaya 22.79, the definition for the aggregate seems very weird. And then the rest is a quote from Samyutta Nikaya 22.79. And why, bhikkhus, do you call it form? It is deformed, bhikkhus, therefore it is called form. Deformed by what? Deformed by cold, deformed by heat, deformed by hunger, deformed by thirst, deformed by contact with flies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and serpents. It is deformed, bhikkhus, therefore it is called form. 2, and it says feelings are easy to understand, so he skips over that one. And then, and why do you call it perception? Because it perceives, thus it is called perception. What does it perceive? It perceives blue, it perceives yellow, it perceives red, it perceives white. Because it perceives, it is called perception. And the next section says, and why do you call it consciousness? Because it cognizes, thus it is called consciousness. What does it cognize? It cognizes what is sour, bitter, pungent, sweet, alkaline, non-alkaline, salty, and unsalty. Because it cognizes, it is called consciousness. And then the last section here says, and why do you call them fabrications? Because they fabricated things. Thus they are called fabrications. What do they fabricate? As a fabricated thing. For the sake of formness, they fabricate form as a fabricated thing. For the sake of feelingness, they fabricate feeling as a fabricated thing. For the sake of perceptionhood, for the sake of fabricationhood, for the sake of consciousnesshood, they fabricate consciousness as a fabricated thing. Because they fabricate fabricated things, they are called fabrications. Unquote. So then Sigālovāda Sutta says, can you please explain what all these mean? They all seem difficult to understand. It's hard to understand the difference between vijnana and sanya, or consciousness and perception, based on this, as they just seem like sensory functions. What form means here, and what mental formations are, as they seem to encompass everything else here, though this seems like it aligns with the 12 links chain thing somehow. Okay, well, first of all, this is one thing that I've never really liked about suttas, and it's partly due to not having an established formal logic in India at the time that the Theravadan texts were composed. And also, they indulge in a lot of like folk etymology. Like this first question, or why bhikkhus do you call it form? Because it is deformed bhikkhus, therefore it is called form. This is just a false etymology. This rupa is the Pali word for form. And then this verb is ropadi, which means it gets like damaged or messed up, or here it's deformed because they got to include form in the answer to make sort of an etymological connection. So it is ropadi or rupadi. I was indulging in a little Burmese pronunciation of Pali there. So yeah, saying that it's rupa because it is deformed, or because of rupadi, then I mean it's not a correct etymology. This is found throughout the text, throughout the commentaries also, where it's just sort of for just teaching purposes or whatever, that they'll give this fake etymology. And it's just runs rampant in the text, and it's not really correct, in my opinion. So let's see. Feelings are easy to understand. Sigālovāda Sutta says, and then when you get to perception, or sanya, why do you call it perception? Because it perceives. And this is sort of not so much bad etymology as just like the lack of good logic, like sound formal logic, where they'll use like a circular definition. You know, it's called perception because it perceives, but if you don't know what perception is, you're hardly likely to know what perceiving is either. So it perceives blue, perceives yellow, perceives red, perceives white. Because it perceives, it is called perception. Yeah, I mean, it's almost not a definition at all. And some of the definitions you're going to find in the suttas and in the commentaries are the same kind of non-definition, just sort of a circular definition using the word itself to define itself, that kind of thing. And then why do you call it consciousness? Because it cognizes. And this is one of the things that Sigālovāda Sutta was asking about. It's like perception and consciousness seem like pretty much the same thing. And I do think that Theravada Buddhism has traditionally misunderstood consciousness. Orthodox Theravada does not understand consciousness. So it's like, from the point of view of like Abhidhamma, Orthodox Theravada, consciousness is sort of like the canvas on which the perception is painted. You can't have the perception without this sort of a background to hold up the perception. You know, it's sort of like, I've seen it defined as, it's like perception is the mental state and consciousness is like the presence of the mental state or some such, which really doesn't work either. So, I mean, the way I understand consciousness and perception is the form of the mind. Consciousness is the substance of the mind. You know, it's like this cup is made out of ceramic. So cup would be the form, ceramic would be the substance. So if this were a perception, The perception would be the cup level of its reality and not the ceramic level of its reality. The ceramic level of its reality would be the consciousness itself. A gold ring. Ring would be like outward form, like perception. Gold would be the substance or essence of the ring, which would be consciousness. That's my definition, and it makes way better sense to me than like the Abhidhamma definition of consciousness, especially because they can't deal with different levels of reality. Orthodox Theravada, possibly because of the logic thing, they cannot deal with different levels of reality. The ancient Greeks had similar problems. So, I mean, let's not just pick on the ancient Indians, but, you know, it's like in Abhidhamma, Nibbana or Nirvana is just right on the same list with everything else they consider to be an ultimate reality. So according to Abhidhamma, according to Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, nose sensitivity is just as real as Nibbana is. And I mean, I just cannot swallow that at all any more than I can swallow like the official narrative of Christianity. I mean, if I had to believe that in order to be a Buddhist, I couldn't be a Buddhist. But fortunately, in Buddhism, you don't have to believe everything you read, which is good. And then again, some people in the West especially will use that as an excuse to just reject anything they don't like, including all that morality stuff. Or karma. You know, that's victim blaming. That's definitely out of fashion in the West, unless the victim is like white or something. So let's see. Consciousness, fabrications. Yeah, I mean, you can find this stuff throughout the suttas where they're not really, I mean, they're supposedly defining things, and you're just as in the dark after reading the definition or the explanation as you were before, maybe even more so. You might be even more confused. So in cases like this, you're better off just kind of working it out on your own or reading a lot and just sort of coming up with the best angle that you find in the text for explaining this stuff. But I mean, this kind of explanation is really not very helpful, except for a dogmatist who's just going to memorize it like a parrot and then think he understands it because he can like repeat it like a parrot. Dogmatists like that are much more common in Buddhist Asia, at least with regard to Buddhism. With regard to Christianity, they might be more common in the West. So, yeah, I mean, with regard to rupa and ropadi, I mean, it's just like a false etymology that's just used for didactic purposes. I think didactic is the correct word in that case. So, yeah, if it all seems difficult for Sigālovāda and Sipad Zidrna to understand, well, welcome to the club, because I don't think, I mean, I don't understand how anybody could really understand this stuff, because it's not really explanatory. It's not really explaining very much. It's just circular definitions using the word itself as part of the explanation of itself. And it doesn't work. So I guess I've kind of semi-ranted and complained enough about Sigālovāda and Sipad Zidrna's second question. So I'm just going to move on to his third question. And the question is this Buddhism in a nutshell? And then he posted a meme of this sort of crying meme face in front of this beautiful natural scenery. And the crying meme face in front of the beautiful scenic picture is saying, I can't believe the demiurge did this. It's horrible. I need to achieve gnosis to escape this hellscape. Everything is imperfect and evil. So no, that's not Buddhism in a nutshell. I would not say that. Although to some degree, like the prehistoric religion of northern India, like from the Indus Valley civilization. I guess there was another civilization that they're just now finding out about that was farther east in the Ganges Valley that may have been associated with the Indus Valley civilization or something. But apparently it was like the spiritual tradition there, and among the Gnostics in the West also, that this whole world is evil and that we should try to escape from that. That, I mean, it's just, there's no point in just wallowing in this imperfection and evil. And I mean, there is some of that in Buddhism, although the Buddha was an enlightened teacher who kind of raised it to an enlightened level. So let's see, where do I go from here? I mean, it's certainly not Buddhism in a nutshell. I mean, Buddhism is really not that simplistic in that, the world or samsara is evil and you must escape from it because it's so horrible. I mean, there's really nothing to escape so much if you're just detached from it. And I mean, you can say it's horrible, and it can be called horrible in the text mainly to stimulate people to want to become enlightened. But I mean, obviously that samsara is not 100% misery and horror. That's pretty clear. To say that even happiness is misery because it doesn't last, you can just turn that on its head and say, even misery is happiness because it doesn't last. So it's not a very good argument. So let's see, where else do I go with this? I mean, it's not Buddhism in a nutshell. So I did answer the question. I mean, it's a very simplistic, exaggerated form of one aspect of Buddhism. But, I mean, if you do achieve gnosis, I mean, you rise above the world. I mean, not necessarily escaping the hellscape, but, I mean, it's better than this world. Enlightenment literally is infinitely better than living a samsaric existence. So, I mean, you just bear that in mind, I guess. And then comparatively speaking, you could say everything is imperfect and evil, like compared to just infinite perfection. But wallowing in that, I mean, it could help some people to renounce the world. I mean, like even in Roman Catholicism, just the idea that the world is the veil of tears and, this body is just like a tomb kind of a thing, did inspire a lot of saints to just really go for it. So it can be helpful in that respect. But yeah, Buddhism, there's certainly a lot more to Buddhism than just that. And then it is kind of a simplistic, exaggerated representation even of a Buddhist attitude, or at least a traditional, wise Buddhist attitude. So I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Bray. And Bray said, when you were a monk, did you witness or hear about other monks engaging in immoral activities? And I think Bray may not be aware of just how finely tuned Buddhist ethics are. In other religions like Christianity, Islam, something is either good or bad. It's 100% good, it's 100% bad, or you could have a certain mix if you're doing more than one thing at the same time. But nevertheless, everything is pretty much clear cut. This is good, this is bad. You should do this, you should avoid that. But Buddhism, it's almost impossible to do anything without a certain amount of immorality involved. Just even to believe that you exist while you're doing it is causing a certain amount of delusion to creep into your motives. And when you have delusional motives, the result is not going to be 100% wholesome. So when I was a monk, did I witness or hear about other monks engaging in immoral activities? Sure. I mean, there's whole different levels of it. Like some of the school monasteries in Mandalay had like soccer teams. You could actually see monks playing soccer, having fun, laughing and stuff. And from a traditional Buddhist point of view, I mean, that's not right. Monks aren't supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. To a normie who isn't a Buddhist who sees monks playing soccer, they might think it's cool. They may think that's fine. I heard one rumor about a monk that I knew who was parajika, that he was having homosexual sex with like a teenage novice. But that was just a rumor that was spread by women at the monastery. And rumors can spread and mutate and be based on almost nothing in Burma. I didn't particularly want to know if this was true or not. I wasn't going to start investigating, take the burden upon myself to prove or vindicate this monk that I knew. But I mean, that's the only real rumor even of like homosexuality being acted out in Burma, in the Sangha. So it's the Burmese monks seem to be much more moral in that regard than Thai monks. I've heard much more about Thai stuff along those lines. I mean, having sex with women, I've heard some stories about that too. So I guess that would be immoral too. Like Burmese Sayadaw, who he's like seducing nuns, that kind of thing. I've heard a few cases of that, especially in the Mahasi tradition. But Mahasi tradition is a big tradition, very widespread. So there's more opportunities to hear something from it than like the The Ingu tradition or something that almost nobody knows about. I've told the story before, just a few Q&As ago, about how I was walking down the street in Rangoon. There was a monk like 50 feet in front of me, walking down the street the same direction as me. I'm just walking behind him. And then there's a pretty girl at a bus stop. And this monk literally, just deliberately, obviously swerves out of his way to grab her ass as he walks by. And the girl's startled. She looks around, sees that it was a monk, and then just pretends nothing happened. And I really wanted to engage in a little immoral activity myself by just walking up behind him, tapping him on the shoulder, and then just punching him in the face. But, I mean, monks engage in immoral activities all the time, like making confession when they're breaking the same rules over and over again, like handling money. And then in the confession, they're saying, yes, sir, very good, sir, I will restrain myself in future, when they know damn well they're not going to. They're just going to keep breaking the rule. They just consider the confession to be a kind of magical blah, blah, blah that makes the offense go away. So, I mean, there's all kinds of immoral activities, from just the very, very subtle stuff, like a monk singing. That's considered to be immoral in Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, especially for a monk. Like laughing in public. I saw a video just today of a monk just laughing out loud in front of a group of people. And I mean, whether or not that's immoral or not, I mean, it kind of is at a very subtle level. And then for a monk to break rules, that's also not good. I mean, that kind of adds another level to the immorality. But then all the way up to, I've heard plausible stories about, some famous Sayadaw, semi-famous anyway, messing around with female supporters and nuns, like literally seducing them, having sex with them. So he wouldn't really be a monk. He'd be excommunicated, technically. Seeing the monk just swerve out of his way on the sidewalk to grab a pretty girl's ass. I mean, yeah, I was a witness to that one. That was like the most immoral thing when I was a monk in Burma, seeing another monk doing, I think. But that was like in broad daylight, just on a city sidewalk. So, I mean, the really immoral stuff, I mean, they're not technically monks anymore. Like a monk who has sex, who commits a parajika offense. Yeah, I mean, I lived at a big school monastery, and it was near Mandalay, and Mandalay monks are notoriously, there's a lot of bad characters in the Sangha around Mandalay. And it was a relatively strict monastery that I was at, relatively. And so all the Sangha would have to congregate on Uposatha Day for the chanting of the Patimokkha rules. If you don't know exactly what that means, that's fine. But all the monks would have to accumulate, they'd have to meet in the meeting hall. And while all the monks were in the meeting hall, there was some monk. He wasn't really a monk anymore, but he was stealing rare books from this is a school monastery. So he'd be sneaking into monks' cabins and taking the rare-ish books, the hard-to-find books, so he could sell them. And so there was the Anunayaka Sayadaw. He was sort of like the leader of my little part of the monastery. It was a big monastery. He was kind of a macho monk. And so one day he decided he wasn't going to go to the ceremony. He was going to deliberately skip the Uposatha ceremony and wait and try and catch this monk who wasn't really a monk anymore because he was a thief, who was stealing stuff and selling it supposedly. And he caught him. And so the monk he didn't even live at that monastery. He was at a nearby, some other monastery. He was sneaking in. He knew when the ceremonies were going to be. And so he was defrocked. I don't know if he was arrested or what, but he was kicked out of the Sangha. And so it was a few weeks later that some monk friend of the thief actually snuck up behind this Anunnaka Seattle, the macho guy who caught the thief, and just chopped him in the back of the head with a machete. And his ear just kind of like peeled off. They were able to kind of sew it back on and everything. But I mean, this is supposedly a monk who did this, although he's probably a thief too. And so, he would be excommunicated and not technically really a monk. But there's all kinds of stuff. Like I went to the Mandalay City morgue to watch autopsies. I did it twice. And the first time, the coroner told me that just a few days beforehand, he had to do an autopsy on a dead monk that was found like lying in a ditch near Mandalay. And he kind of conspiratorially kind of almost whispered to me that he thinks it was other monks who killed him. So, I mean, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's just rotten monks out there around Mandalay, especially in Sigālovāda division. It's just lax monks. It's not so much like evil monks there. It's just sloppy monks. And then in Shan State also, it's kind of notorious for just sort of immoral monks. Like there was this Australian monk who told me this story once about how a monk moved into some remote village in Shan State. They had a monastery. They didn't have any monks living there. So they were very happy for this monk to come and stay there. And because they didn't know how to deal with monks, he was having to teach them. And he was realizing these people don't know what monks are supposed to do or not. So he was saying, I'm going to need a virgin every time I do the Uposatha ceremony. So every 2 weeks, they're sending him like a teenage girl. And she's not a virgin anymore by the time she leaves the monastery. So finally, I mean, he lived like that for decades until finally he died. And then a new monk shows up. Very first, I mean, he's like a relatively serious monk who just shows up to live in this monastery, which is now vacant. Very first Uposatha ceremony, they send him a girl. And he's like, oh, what's this girl for? She's to help you do Uposatha, venerable sir. So, I mean, there is a lot of just wise guy, crooked monks out there, not only in Burma. I think there might even be more in Thailand, from what I've heard. At least you hear about it more in Thailand. Probably in Sri Lanka also. So, yeah, that kind of stuff goes on. But in Burma, I have to admit, it's like compared with Roman Catholicism, they're very well behaved, I think. Just in general, the average Burmese monk is mild-mannered. He might not follow Vinaya very strictly, but he's not a bad person. I mean, probably the same goes for Catholic priests, but there's less rampant, like I said, the stories of homosexuality actually being practiced in Burma. I just heard one rumor from a very unreliable source that like heterosexual messing around, I heard more about that. But still, I don't think it would compare with like Thailand. The Burmese are just a very stoic, ascetic kind of a people anyway. They're not a sensuous, passionate kind of people like the Thais are, definitely to a greater degree. So, yeah, I did witness or hear about other monks engaging in immoral activities. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Sampapalapa. I was just making sure. It's like this compulsive thing where every once in a while, just to make sure, I'll see that it's really recording. And somebody actually asked me about this, so I'm going to have to go into greater detail when I get to that question. But anyway, Sampapalapa says, what are some of the interesting differences of Burmese people and American people? Well, what really struck me is one of the similarities between Burmese people and American people. So before I get to the differences, which is going to be harder for me to think of, the most interesting similarity between Burmese people and American people is as follows. When I went to Burma, and I'm in a foreign culture, very foreign to America, you see people just acting differently. They've got very different values and suppositions. They've got different premises that they consider to be self-evident, that kind of a thing. And they were obviously very culturally conditioned. I could see how culturally conditioned they were, but they were oblivious to this. I mean, if you tried to explain to a Burmese person that they're culturally conditioned, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, probably. So I lived in that that world for many years, came back to America. And after living in Burma for so long, when I came back to America, it was like almost the same thing. Americans, they have all these assumptions that are just programmed into them through their culture. They are so culturally conditioned. And if I would even hint at this, like at a Dhamma hall, people would start getting offended. That every single American at that Dhamma hall resembled every other American at that Dhamma hall more than they resembled any of the Burmese Buddhists that I was interacting with at some other Dhamma hall in Burma. But they want to be individuals. They want to think that they're acting just based on their own judgment and so forth. They don't realize how profoundly culturally conditioned they are. So that's the interesting non-difference. And the cultural conditioning is different, but both sides, the Americans and the Burmese, are just oblivious to just how deeply culturally conditioned they are. But with regard to the interesting differences of Burmese people and American people, well, the Burmese are devoutly Buddhist. I mean, they're dogmatically Buddhist. They assume that everything in the text has to be true. In fact, everything in the commentaries has to be true. Maybe even everything in the sub-commentaries has to be true. So the Burmese are very dogmatic. And from a religious point of view, especially out in the villages that haven't been modernized much, they have like a worldview similar to like a medieval European Catholic. You know, they just have pretty much of a medieval outlook on life. And they have no doubt at all about ghosts and witches and magic and demonic possession and this kind of a thing. And, you know, they just assume that when science says one thing and the ancient suttas say something else, they follow the suttas. You know, they still belong to the kind of culture where the older a book is, the more reliable it is. Unlike in the West, where the newer a book is, the more reliable it is. If people even read books anymore. So, yeah, I mean, Americans, they're just programmed into scientific realism, and, you know, they just accept parts of Buddhism that are not inconvenient and that they can fit into the scientific worldview. And so that's one of the main differences. Whereas the Burmese just, they're kind of the opposite. You know, they start off with the Buddhist worldview and then they try to fit science into that. So there is that. Interesting differences. Well, the Burmese they're spiritual materialists, whereas in the West we're more material materialists. You know, the Burmese think that, you know, just merit is a kind of metaphysical money. And that's one of the reasons why Burma is a poor country. Certainly not the only reason, probably not the most important reason why Burma is a poor country, but one of the reasons why Burma is a poor country is that people are more interested in building pagodas than in building schools or bridges or that kind of a thing. And it's just that their capacity to endure unpleasant circumstances is just phenomenal. I mean, it's just beyond me. Even when I was a monk and I'm practicing equanimity and so forth, at least trying to cultivate equanimity, some of the stuff the Burmese can accept without, I mean, it doesn't bug them at all. A dog barking outside their window all night long. You know, they'll just like put the pillow over the head if they even use a pillow, instead of just like a block of wicker, like a wicker square or something, a cube. Some people will use those as a kind of pillow. You know, it just doesn't occur to them to go out and chase the dog away. Tell the dog to shut up. Maybe throw a rock at it. Or just blasting cheesy pop music over loudspeakers. It's like I would lie there in my cave just fantasizing about just marching into that village with a baseball bat and just beating up their PA system. You know, being careful not to actually, you know, smash any skulls or anything, but still, I'd beat the hell out of that PA system. Whereas the Burmese, they like it. But I don't want to just keep going on and on. So I'm just going to move on to Sam Papalapa's next question here. I wonder if he goes by Sam for short. Anyways, his second question is, do you think the Buddhist idea of craving, intention, and karma is something like a missing link in understanding psychology or sentient life better? I think it's probably already had the most influence on the whole world's understanding of sentient beings, psychology being that it seems that the Buddha was the first psychologist we've ever had. Well, I mean, he may be the first famous psychologist that we're aware of, but I think any kind of meditation master, and there were meditation masters before the time of the Buddha, I'm sure, that, I mean, they would know their own mind fairly well. And so they would know the minds of other people fairly well too, even setting aside the ability to read minds, which some very advanced people can apparently do. So, I mean, that wouldn't be so much a matter of like Buddhist doctrines of craving and intention and karma. It would just be more like just being very mindful of your own mental states and maybe having a certain amount of telepathy or empathy where you're able to know what other people are thinking, and you'd be observing their mind the way you observe your own, and you'd be observing them operating at a cruder level than you're operating, and so you get all these insights as to the human condition. So, but with regard to Buddhist doctrines of craving and karma, is that something like a missing link in understanding psychology better? Well, I don't know about psychology nowadays, although back in the late 70s, early 80s, there started being a new kind of more scientific psychology called cognitive science. And it kind of got shot in the head because academia became more leftist, and cognitive science was discovering unpleasant truths about how, like, for example, males and females have sexual dimorphism with regard to their mental states as well as their bodies. This kind of stuff is just taboo now. And so I think cognitive science has been sort of suppressed to some degree. But one of the things about cognitive science is that, you know, fear is like in almost any human interaction. There's like a subliminal layer of fear. There's always this craving of just be alive, stay alive. You know, it's just this subliminal background noise that we don't even notice really. Like a fish doesn't notice that it's wet, where it's just like, you know, survival and just constant unease, constant discomfort, like this mild agitation and unease is always with us. And I mean, they're trying to demonstrate this scientifically. You know, this is one of the things that they were learning about back in the 80s, back before cognitive science went out of fashion among leftists. So with regard to karma, though, I mean, the metaphysical actions of karma, that's beyond science. So, I mean, that'd be beyond mainstream psychology. But then again, I'm not even sure if that's what he's asking here. So do I think the Buddhist idea of craving, intention, and karma is something like a missing link in understanding psychology and sentient life better? Well, it certainly can be. Yeah, I mean, karma especially if you kind of set aside the whole idea of karma as this, the way most people think of karma, you know, some metaphysical force that acts upon us from above. You know, it's like, I was a Roman soldier 2,000 years ago and I killed some barbarians. And so now I'm going to get knifed in a back alley in Detroit or something as a result of that. I mean, that's kind of the way a lot of people think of karma. But if you think of karma more along the lines of Schopenhauer's will, then I think it can really open up one's understanding of how the world works and how the human mind works and so forth. Let's see, I think it's probably already had the most influence on the whole world's understanding of sentient being psychology, being that it seems that the Buddha was the first psychologist we've ever had. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure how much Buddhist doctrine or Buddhist philosophy has influenced the West, which is where most like organized psychology has arisen. I think wherever you're going to have meditators, like in Christianity, throughout the Middle Ages, you had like contemplative sects where you have monks and nuns sitting in cells, observing their own mind, that kind of a thing. So a lot of it would just probably come from the Christian contemplative traditions. And just, you're going to have like brilliant perceptive people that are going to pick up on stuff anyway, like Dostoevsky. I mean, he probably knew very little about Buddhism, but he knew the human mind better than most psychologists do, I'm pretty sure. And a lot of that he learned from being in a prison camp in Siberia, because he started off as a kind of leftist, and so he was almost going to be executed, and then they commuted his sentence to like X number of years in a prison colony in Siberia, where he was surrounded by hardened criminals, and he was just a very keen observer of the human race, his fellow humans, and you just pick up a lot of stuff just from observing other people if you're got a really perceptive eye in that regard. So, yeah, I'm not so sure how well Buddhist ideas have helped like the Western psychological community to understand the human mind better. Although to the individual Buddhist, it can help a lot. But I really don't know exactly how to answer this question correctly. So I think I'm just going to move on to Sam Papalapa's second or third question here. It's the third one. Sometimes I have difficulty counting higher than 2. So Sam Papalapa, or Sam, says, is there a country that is recorded to have a more elite group of practitioners than others? Well, I think if you're Burmese, then that country would be considered Burma. And if you're Thai, that country would be considered Thailand. And if you're in Nepal or northern India, you would consider that country to be Nepal or India. I think a lot of like wisdom cultures, like or Buddhist or like Eastern traditions, will always consider their own country to be the most advanced with regard to understanding the Dharma or whatever. But I don't know how they would, how you'd verify this. I mean, you could have opinions recorded that this country or that country has more elite practitioners, but I don't know how you'd actually prove that. You know, it's like the ascended masters of the Himalayas. You know, there's all these people trying to go and find the ascended masters of the Himalayas, or communicating through psychic means like Madame Blavatsky or something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, throughout the world, you're going to have spiritual geniuses. They might be born in 16th century Spain. They might be born in ancient India. They might be born in modern Burma, wherever, modern America. You're going to have spiritual geniuses just arising just through statistics, if nothing else. Just the odds that it's going to happen, you know, eventually it just happens. So I don't know. Maybe the more spiritually oriented cultures are going to have more of these like spiritual super geniuses. And it's going to change over time. You know, it's like China went through like late ancient, early medieval times. You know, they just had this flourishing spiritual golden age of, at least if you can believe the Zen koan collections, you know, the Zen material, that you had all these enlightened masters it was just swarming with them practically in like late, or especially like early medieval China. But I kind of doubt China's like that anymore. So let's just read the question again, shall we? Is there a country that is recorded to have more elite group of practitioners than others? Maybe India. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think there'd be any way of verifying this. So it would all be just guesses and matters of opinion. And different people would have different criteria for what would constitute an elite group of practitioners. So, yeah, even 16th century Spain had some real heavy hitters walking around. But, yeah, it might be any country that has the most devout and advanced spiritual tradition. So Theravada Buddhism, like Burma, I assume has some spiritual heavy hitters out there. I'm just going to move on to the next question, though. This is from GameFap. Nobody's asked this question before. Have you seen Rambo 4, which is set in Burma? I remember to many people, this movie was the first time they ever heard of Burma or the long-going conflict there. Yeah, according to the beginning of the movie, the caption or the screen verbiage said that it's the longest going civil war in existence right now. Just the war, especially between the Karens and the Burmese in Karen state mostly. But yeah, I did see Rambo 4. In fact, I can't remember if I saw it in Burma or not. But the thing was, I knew a monk that had Rambo 4 when in Burma. He was a Burmese monk living in Burma. And it was, if I remember correctly, 20 years in prison if you were found in possession of that movie, Rambo 4, where Rambo almost single-handedly defeats the entire Burmese army. And one thing I learned from watching that movie is that Burmese soldiers, when you shoot them, they pop like a ripe tomato. But there was another movie where it was a similar severe punishment if you were caught in possession of the DVD or whatever it was. And it was a picture of at the time, the dictator's daughter. I think it was Than Shui's daughter getting married. And she was just encrusted with diamonds. You know, she's the dictator's daughter, probably not very pretty, and just encrusted with diamonds. And then it would keep going from that to scenes of what was going on like a couple of blocks away from the wedding, where people are just living in dirt and squalor. So it's like encrusted with diamonds, dirt and squalor. Encrusted with diamonds, dirt and squalor. And so it was like 15 or 20 years in prison for anyone found in possession of that too, which is standard. I mean, censorship really is, it's like a method used by scoundrels. You know, it's like, we don't want you to know the truth, and so we're going to conceal that truth and punish anybody who even finds out about that truth. And it's becoming more prevalent in the West, as many of you no doubt have noticed. So yeah, I did see Rambo 4. I mean, it was kind of idealized. I like how they had real Burmese advisors to make it more realistic. And so, you know, I had like, there's one scene especially that I'm thinking, man, that's brilliant. That's just like Burma, where it had like this little Burmese soldier in the big floppy hat, and he's kind of like swinging his legs out when he walks, kind of like this. And a lot of Burmese people do actually walk that way. I've been told it's partly because Burmese mothers, especially if they live in the village, they'll hold their baby on their hip, which causes the baby's legs to kind of you know, like spread out like this, so they walk like ducks when they get older. But yeah, I did see the movie. I can't remember if I saw it in Burma or in America though. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui asks a concomitant question. I don't know what it is concomitant to. He doesn't specify what it is concomitant to, but he says a concomitant question would be, is samsara perfectible? And no, samsara is not perfectible. I mean, that's one of the hallmark qualities of samsara. It is that it is imperfect. It is dukkha. So I guess if you become enlightened, then you look at the dukkha and it becomes perfect dukkha. You know, perfect misery. Everything is perfect. If you look at samsara with perfect eyes, then you could say, yeah, all this misery and suffering is just perfect misery and suffering. But yeah, samsara is not perfectible. That's why it's samsara. It is delusion that is generating samsara. I mean, delusion is like, at least in some versions of dependent co-arising, it is like the original cause of all of this samsaric existence or phenomena. It arises largely due to delusion, if not entirely due to delusion, and you perfect the delusion and it's not delusion anymore. Unless it's just perfect delusion and everything's perfect. So yeah, samsara is not perfectible. At least not from a Buddhist point of view, and that's why you transcend samsara and become enlightened. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, have you heard of New German medicine? I think you would be a natural with it. And no, I've never heard of it. This is the first I've ever heard of New German medicine. I don't know what New German medicine is. I assume it's something alternative. I don't think it's going to be big pharma churning out this new German medicine, but I don't know what it is. So I'm just going to have to move on to the next question. This is from Extremely Rare Bird. An Extremely Rare Bird says, it is said in the Dhammapada, faint is this fragrance of lavender and sandalwood, but fragrant of the virtuous, soars sublime amongst the gods. So that's the quote from the Dhammapada. And then he says, I'm sure this is poetic language, but can it also be taken literally? Can devas and gods smell virtue, or perhaps see it by other means? It is said that they communicate telepathically, so I guess it's not too big a stretch. Well, yeah, I think that higher beings, they would at least feel there's like a higher vibe in the air. You know, there's higher consciousness in this area. I mean, even an ordinary human. Like if you're in a dark, you know, you're surrounded by like, I don't know, criminals or just like, I don't know what to call them, you know, people at the bottom of the register. And I mean, you're like in a crummy trailer park or something. Not that I'm trying to make fun of people that live in crummy trailer parks, but I mean, just sort of shady characters. They don't have to say anything or do anything really. You just get like this bad vibe off of them. Whereas if you're around saints, let's say, you're going to be more at ease. There's going to be less of this subliminal angst in the air that you're going to pick up on. And I'm sure the gods are sensitive to that sort of thing, probably way more than the average human. So yeah, I'm sure they could pick up on like wiser, more virtuous people as opposed to less wise, less virtuous people. Just sort of feel it in the air, I would guess. Or also they can read minds supposedly. And so, you know, there's various ways, but trying to guess exactly how small g gods perceive humans is kind of silly. It's sort of like trying to, like a dog trying to guess how humans perceive dogs. They just can't do it. Or just maybe at a very crude level, but they're not going to do it much justice. So I guess I'll just move on to Extremely Rare Bird's next question after looking to see how long I've been yammering here. Okay. So Extremely Rare Bird says, I've been reading Ascent of Mount Carmel. Well, congratulations. And I'm trying to understand the Carmelites and St. John of the Cross's understanding of God. The Carmelites, as I understand it, seek to stop manufacturing beliefs about God because he cannot be grasped by thought. They dismiss and mistrust all of their senses, yet they still seem to assert God to be an external agency with a will, and that the Bible is truth, the knowledge of which they do gain through the same senses. This is a contradiction, or is it? What do you make of this? Well, one thing you have to bear in mind is that somebody like St. John of the Cross was in fact living in 16th century Spain when the Spanish Inquisition was at its peak. And I mean, you can't just say, you know, well, parts of the Bible aren't true or parts of the Bible are mistaken, because you're going to have the Inquisition down your neck. And St. John of the Cross was he was a discalced Carmelite. He was part of a reform movement that was bitterly resented by the unreformed Carmelites. And so, I mean, he had a target on his back already. You'd have like the papal nuncio or some high like authority figure in the Catholic Church. Sometimes they'd be on the side of the reform movement. Sometimes they'd be on the side of the unreformed Carmelites. And if he was on the side of the unreformed Carmelites, I mean, you have an even bigger target on your back. In fact, St. John of the Cross was imprisoned and just fed like, it was like bread and water and taken out and whipped periodically until finally he was able to escape. But there's a good chance he would have died if he hadn't escaped just from malnutrition or freezing to death or something. And so, I mean, if you're born into a religion, there's just a certain amount of dogma that you just have to be willing to accept. I mean, you don't have much choice. And so St. John of the Cross, who I think may have been fully enlightened, and he would definitely have made a very good Buddhist. He would have been much happier in India, I think. But still, I mean, he was getting into trouble, and he was getting into big trouble. In fact, he was seriously considering just emigrating to Mexico and becoming a missionary right before he died, just because there was so much heat and just so much political bullshit against him and everything. So, yeah, I mean, I think religion for a lot of people is just sort of a necessary mental illness to some degree anyway, where you just have to accept paradoxes, like confusing, contradictory stuff. I mean, you just have to accept it. You know, that's just the way it is somehow. I don't get it. It's fine. That's just the way it is anyway. So, I mean, mainly with regard to meditation or contemplation, St. John of the Cross was very wise in telling the meditators under his guidance, doesn't matter what it is that arises, just let it go. Just do not follow it. You know, even if it's like Jesus Christ himself standing in front of you, the devil can imitate or impersonate an angel of light. I mean, if Jesus really wants you to know something, you're going to know it. So just don't be like interrupting your contemplation by like getting, distracted by this stuff. Whatever arises, just let it go. And he says that, I mean, you can't know the God through any kind of mental process. At least, yeah, I guess that'd be a correct thing to say, that you cannot know God through your imagination, through your intellect, through your feelings, through any kind of perception or feeling. So you just have to dismiss all of that. And then all that's left is just this radiant emptiness that you don't really perceive, but he calls it dark faith. And it's like the presence of God that you can be aware of somehow after you have dismissed all the intellect and the feelings and the perceptions and all that kind of stuff that cannot know God. The only way to know God is just directly. So let's see, how far did I digress from the question? That is my question to myself at this point. See, they still seem to assert God to be an external agency. They had no choice. I mean, you deny that, you get burned at the stake. With a will, and that the Bible is truth. Yeah, I mean, to some degree, you have to accept this basic tenets of Christianity. That God, I mean, you can never merge with God, really. That the highest you can achieve from a Buddhist or a Christian point of view is the beatific vision, where after you die, you can be in the presence of God. But God is still considered to be like a separate entity, maybe sitting on a throne surrounded by angels. But at the same time, St. John of the Cross would be saying that, this world is just based on God. I mean, the Spirit of God pervades everything. So in a way, he's kind of like the bearded man, and because that's, the Old Testament especially gives a lot of, statements along those lines. But still, I mean, you progress, but still you can't completely let go of this older stuff because, as I say, it's fundamental dogma. It's right there in the scriptures. And if you try to dismiss that, you get burned at the stake after being severely tortured. So, I mean, he wouldn't even be really a Christian anymore if he dismissed some of the basic fundamental beliefs about God that are mainstream or traditional in Christianity. So, yeah, I mean, he was really pushing it because he was saying there's like this stage of the perfected. And I mean, which would seem to be analogous to the Buddhist arahant. But I mean, I was surprised at even reading that because according to Christianity, even nobody is worthy. You only get into heaven through the grace of God because nobody's perfect. And here's St. John of the Cross saying not only is there a stage of perfection, but like his mentor, St. Teresa of Avila, was perfect. But then again, he thought that like King David was perfect, which I don't know. Maybe he became perfect after Bathsheba Gate or something. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to Extremely Rare Bird's next question, which is, what do you think of the following quotes by Jung? Is it cynical, dramatic, or true? And then in 1938, in reaction to Hitler and the murmurings of World War II, he described nations as big blind worms. And then it's a quote, following what? Fate, perhaps. A nation has no honor. It has no word to keep. Not everybody has virtues, but everybody has the low animal instincts, the basic primitive caveman suggestibility, the suspicious and vicious traits of the savage. The result is that when you get a nation of many millions of people, it is not even human. It is a lizard or a crocodile or a wolf. That's what a nation is, a monster. Everybody ought to fear a nation. It is a horrible thing. How can such a thing have honor or a word? That's why I am for small nations. Small nations mean small catastrophes. Big nations mean big catastrophes. Unquote. So I think to some degree Jung was kind of depressed by the political situation in 1938. Like, this reminds me of Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which he wrote during World War II, and it's pretty cynical and dark. I mean, he was in a bad mood when he wrote it. And I think Jung may have been in kind of a bad mood when he writes some of this stuff, because he does write some kind of dark, cynical stuff. But then again, I'm not entirely sure that a nation is only like the lowest common denominator of the humans that compose it. That reminds me of, was it not the madness of crowds? It's something, the crowd. It's Le Bon, Gustave Le Bon, who wrote this. It's one of the first psychological works about just like mass hysteria. And I mean, he kind of agrees with Jung here that, when you've got like a mob of people, it all just kind of goes down to like animal level. And they can just believe anything and just do all kinds of stupid, ridiculous, hysterical stuff that they wouldn't do in their calmer moments when they were alone. But on the other hand, I do have this idea that a nation can be a kind of higher form of life. That, the people in a nation are kind of like the cells in an organism, and they're oblivious to any kind of higher functioning going on. It's like some muscle cell in your arm is completely oblivious to the fact that it's part of this whole human. And it may be at some weird level that we can't really be aware of, that populations have a kind of higher consciousness that, it might be still kind of stupid, but still it might be in a way like more advanced, more multi-dimensional than us, and that we can't even begin to understand it. But that's neither here nor there. And I do have to admit that mass hysteria does kind of like contradict that idea, because mass hysteria is pretty stupid, I have to admit. And it's like political parties are relying on mass hysteria to get people to vote in the way they want them to vote, especially the more like the globalist types now. But it's not entirely restricted to them. So not everybody has virtues. Yeah, I think pretty much everybody would have to have at least some virtues. Hitler loved his dog. Of course, he shot him at the end. But still, let's see. I'm going to the emergency backup beverage now. So let's see. What is the exact question here? Let's see. Is it cynical, dramatic, or true? I'd say it's a combination of all three. But I do think that to some degree, his perception of the situation was definitely conditioned and influenced by just looming world war. So, he likes small nations better than big nations. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I don't really understand his point of view well enough to really critique it very well. But I did say something, and that's something, isn't it? So you get a nation of many millions of people, it is not even human, it is a lizard or a crocodile or a wolf. Yeah, that's definitely an exaggeration, because a large nation, it is able to accomplish really complicated things. So it's definitely beyond a lizard or a crocodile or a wolf. In that respect, it's beyond an ordinary human, because a nation can do things that a single ordinary human absolutely cannot do. One person cannot create like spacecraft. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck says, can you provide us a Buddhist perspective on crypto or Bitcoin? And I don't think there is a Buddhist perspective on crypto or Bitcoin. I don't have any kind of cryptocurrency right now, just because, I don't know, I just never got around to it or whatever. When I first started hearing about Bitcoin, it was it just seemed pretty shaky, mainly because it's not based on anything. I mean, regular money isn't really based on anything anymore. It used to be based on gold, like in America. Supposedly Fort Knox had the Federal Reserve, all these just bricks of gold, and your money was represented by this gold, and I don't think that's true anymore. So I mean, like something like crypto or Bitcoin, it's sort of like the currency of Genghis Khan, I think it was, where he just made money that wasn't based on any precious metals, and that what really supported the value of that money, that it was like paper tokens or something, was if you did not accept it, you'd have your head chopped off. Maybe both hands first, and then your head. But crypto, yeah, it's I'm not exactly sure where the value of it comes from. But a Buddhist perspective, I mean, obviously there is no traditional, the suttas aren't going to say anything about crypto. Even the medieval sub commentaries aren't going to say anything about crypto. So, I mean, it's just a matter of mental states, really. I mean, if you're kind of gambling, then, I mean, gambling is kind of frowned upon by traditional Buddhism. And I'm going to get to that a little later, probably pretty soon, because we're going through this list pretty well. So a Buddhist perspective on crypto or Bitcoin, so long as your mental states are wholesome, whatever you do is wholesome. So long as your mental states are unwholesome, whatever you do is unwholesome. And that includes handling cryptocurrency. And that's about as Buddhist of a perspective as I can come up with, because obviously crypto and Bitcoin are not mentioned. I mean, even real money isn't mentioned all that much in the ancient texts. I mean, at the time of the Buddha, money was still an innovation in India. It was sort of a recent import from like Babylonia or something. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And Outer Haven says, seeing what's currently going on in Bangladesh, the Burmese are well within their right to suppress the spread of Islam. The Bengals, or the Bengalis, have lost their indigenous culture and values due to this Arabian invention. Do you have any recommendations for the Burmese so they do not become the next victims? Well, I think the best thing that the Burmese could do, if they do not want Islam to be imported into their country to such an extent that it reaches like a critical mass where they become aggressive and intolerant, which is the main concern of the Burmese. The government, the Burmese army, has already driven out most of the Rohingyas, and the Rohingyas don't even want to come back. So that problem is pretty much solved, except if Burma liberalizes again, like they did in 2011, and you have this flood of NGOs and just Western capitalists and just Western people in general flooding into the country. And these NGOs especially are just pressuring the Burmese government to let the Rohingyas come back in, to like resettle the Rohingyas and just be open with regard to immigration, like globalists in general want everybody to do as a general rule. So I think so long as the military dictatorship remains in power and the globalists avoid Burma like the plague, like they did for a long time before 2011, I don't think there's much danger of Islam, like Muslims living in Burma, just reproducing to produce this critical mass. So I don't think that Burma's in any real danger right now. There's still quite a few Muslims living in Burma. I think Islam is probably like the second or third most populous country or religion in Burma, but still, it's probably the percentages in single digits. But the British, during British times, imported a lot of Muslims, including the Rohingyas, just for various reasons, just settling them in newly cleared farmland and so forth. That's what the Rohingyas were doing. And the Burmese just never really saw them as real Burmese citizens because they were just imposed upon them by, the colonialists, the English oppressor, so to speak. So, yeah, I think if Burma does not want to be taken over by Islam, probably their best bet is to stay with the military dictatorship and keep globalist liberalism as out of the country as possible. But I mean, it's a two-bladed sword. It's like the military dictatorship is, I mean, they're brutal and incompetent. They're not good people, a lot of them. So, I mean, Burma just has to stay isolated and poor and oppressed. But that's really does have, it's a mixed blessing. It has its advantages. Just about anything has advantages and disadvantages. Any new improvement is going to bring with it new problems. So I think it's sort of the Burmese under the military dictatorship. It's pretty much the way Burma has been for centuries, many centuries, over 1,000 years, because before the military dictatorship, they've had a few interludes of incompetent democracy. And then before that, they had the British Raj, who ruled. I mean, Burma was probably best governed by the British colonialists. You might think colonialism is evil and all that. Even so, Burma reached its zenith of prosperity under the British. And then before that, I mean, you had dictatorial kings, you had despots. And so I think the Burmese mind and culture and so forth are just kind of, it's like they're acclimated to having like brutal, oppressive leaders. And that's the way a lot of the world was before people like the British came along. One of the reasons, at least one of the propaganda reasons why the British conquered northern Burma, they already had taken over southern Burma. Like Upper Burma was still an independent kingdom with a flood of economic migrants leaving the Upper Kingdom into colonized lower Burma. That the fortune teller of the king, or one of his fortune tellers, told him, this area is running out of juju. We're going to have to move the capital again, because they did that a lot. Fortune tellers would say, the whatever forces in the government have used up all the juju here, so we're going to have to move the capital somewhere else. The king realized that was a bad idea. They just couldn't afford it. So as a compromise, they decided to just bury, it was 400 people alive around the outside circumference of the royal compound, the seat of government. And for some reason, when people found out about it, they just started fleeing Mandalay. That was the capital city. Just obviously they considered themselves unworthy of such an honor. And so the British kind of had that in the newspapers back in England, justifying their taking over Upper Burma. And so having a brutal dictatorship in Burma, I mean, that's what the Burmese, they've had it since there was Burma, pretty much. So I guess, they can handle it better than we can. Just being oppressed, not so much as, I mean, they're not so much citizens as just subjects. But the Burmese can just accept bad situations to a degree that just appears superhuman to us Westerners. And they're still, as a general rule, so long as they're not in a village that's just being overrun by the soldier that's just shooting people in the streets and so forth, my experience is in Burma, the average Burmese villager has less unhappiness in his life than the average American. And it's very easy to explain. It's the Four Noble Truths. Second Noble Truth, suffering is caused by desire. The Burmese just have a phenomenal lack of desire as a general rule. Whereas in the West, we're encouraged to have desire. Desire is good. You got to have ambition. You got to want that new car to fuel the economy and all that. In Burma, it's just not that way. And so they just kind of make peace with whatever situation they are in and just live a dharmic life as well as they can. So let's see. I guess I answered that question. The answer to the question was maybe 5% of what I was actually saying, but the answer is in there. You're going to have to tease it out. And I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Romeo. And Romeo said, in Q&A number 105, you speculated on what you thought the Buddha would think of Jesus. I was wondering if you could address the reverse. Are you aware of Jesus giving any opinions on the Buddha or on Buddhism? How about Christianity in general? Are you aware of any official statements from previous popes or other Christian theologians on the Buddha or Buddhism? Well, I mean, the new Rainbow Pope has gone and visited Buddhist countries and participated in Buddhist ceremonies and so forth, but he's not really a typical sort of pope. Maybe I should just back up here to wondering if I could address the reverse. Am I aware of Jesus giving any opinions on the Buddha or on Buddhism? No, I don't think. Probably Jesus never heard of the Buddha or Buddhism. That would be my guess. I mean, there may have been some influence on Jesus from Buddhism. Let's say that the Buddha was, or like Jesus was a disciple of John the Baptist, who may have been an Essene. The Essenes may have gotten some of their ideas from Buddhism. But whether Jesus was even aware of the existence of the Buddha or of Indian Buddhism, I have no idea. There's no mention of it in the Bible, obviously. And any information about what Jesus believed or his opinions that's found outside of the Bible is even more suspect than what you're going to find in the New Testament itself. And according to the Vatican, no more than about 20% of the words attributed to Jesus in the New Testament are likely to be authentic. So with regard to the opinions of Jesus with regard to Buddhism or the Buddha himself, it's really hard to say because we don't really know who Jesus was very well. I mean, what was the real Jesus like? Was he so Jewish that he thought anyone who isn't Jewish is just like damned? I mean, some Jewish people believe that. I mean, you know, God was on their side. They're God's chosen people. On the other hand, maybe he was, in his wisdom, he would recognize that the Buddha was also extremely wise and that Buddhism was teaching morality and you know, like higher consciousness and so forth, even though it's technically an atheistic system. So, I mean, I don't know the personality of Jesus well enough to know whether he would approve of the Buddha or disapprove of the Buddha. If he approved of the Buddha, it would be just through wisdom. You know, the Buddha was wise and good, and so Jesus approved of that. If he disapproved of the Buddha, it'd probably just because, you know, he was a heathen. You know, he wasn't a Jew. He didn't believe in God, that kind of thing. And I really don't know enough about Jesus. The New Testament is really not 100% reliable with regard to the attitudes of Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's just another one of those questions that I don't think anybody can really know unless maybe they're omniscient. I mean, you can just make your best guess. I would like to guess that Jesus would have approved of the Buddha, but I don't know. So Christianity in general, with regard to Buddha and Buddhism, I mean, you got the whole spectrum. I do think that it's the official position of the Vatican, not starting even with the Rainbow Pope, that in modern times, the Vatican has accepted that other people can go to heaven also through following their own religious systems. So Christianity, at least Roman Catholicism, is no longer like chauvinistic to the point of you have to be a member of the Catholic Church or you're going to burn in hell. But then again, some Protestant Christians are still of the opinion that if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to burn in hell. And I've like seen comments on, like, in Breitbart, you know, Breitbart comment section, which is kind of interesting actually. you get a good cross section of the mind of like right wingers or conservatives, people who vote Republican. And there's some people that are just hysterical. Like when they see that I'm a Buddhist, they're just saying that you're going to go to hell. It's like when you're reciting these mantras, the mantras are just the names of demons that you're calling, and you just twist your body into weird contortions in order to allow the demons to come in more easily. And it's just something that some ignorant preacher told them at some sermon. Maybe they saw it on a YouTube video or something, and they're just repeating it without understanding Buddhism, or even knowing that Buddhism isn't the same as yoga, where you're adopting the weird postures and all that. So, you're going to get the full spectrum with regard to Christianity in general, and it would largely depend on different schools of Christianity. So, yeah, a lot of like the fundamentalists, like the evangelical Protestant sects, would probably say if you don't belong to their sect, you're going to burn in hell, and even Catholics are going to burn in hell. So am I aware of any official statements from previous popes or other Christian theologians on the Buddha or Buddhism? Not specifically. I'm sure previous popes were like, approving of Jesuits going to Japan to convert the heathens there. So, back in the old days, popes were still trying to get the whole world to convert to Catholicism, I think. Or at least, the Western world, but, they're still sending missionaries everywhere, trying to save the heathen. But, I cannot recall coming across any high-profile Christian pope or otherwise giving his opinion of Buddhism. I've probably come across it, but again, with regard to the Jesus's opinion of the Buddha, that's anybody's guess, because I don't know the personality of Jesus well enough to know that whether he would be like open-minded enough to accept a non-Jew teacher as wise and worthy of approval and praise or not. And with regard to Christianity, like I said, it's going to be the full spectrum. There's going to be some Christians that think Buddhism is fine. There's going to be other Christians who insist that anyone who doesn't belong to their particular school of Christianity is damned to hellfire. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Twin Wasabi. And this one is kind of a similar kind of question. Panyo Basa, any thoughts on the Latter-day Saints in the Book of Mormon? Can they be described as Christian, even if there are severe differences? Well, and I think they're pretty obviously Christian, since Jesus is still number one in their book. My thoughts on the Book of Mormon, though, I actually did read the Book of Mormon in a cave in Burma. And, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say it's difficult to find a single true sentence in the entire Book of Mormon, because the entire narrative is based on this idea that there was a wise Jewish person living in Jerusalem, and God ordered him to leave Jerusalem before the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem. And he was constructed to build, I think it was 2 arks, and they put some animals and their families, and then they crossed the ocean. And it doesn't say exactly where they landed, but you can tell that probably they landed like in Central America. And then from there, these people, these settlers, they got divided up into 2 main tribes. I remember the bad guys were the Lamanites. The Lamanites were cursed by God and turned brown and ugly because they didn't believe in Jesus 600 years before Jesus was ever born. And then they became the American Indians. And it's strange that the Book of Mormon was originally, the Mormons were trying to convert the Indians, while at the same time their book is saying that the Indians are cursed Jews who were punished for not believing in Jesus 600 years before Jesus was ever born. And it's just, if you read the Book of Mormon, it's like all the wars, they're fought in 2 ways, apparently because Joseph Smith was no military strategist at all. So all the wars they're like, if a city is besieged, they're going to try and capture a city. They got 2 different methods. One is right out of the book of Joshua, where you got the main army fights up against the city walls and then pretends to retreat. And then when the army follows after them, they conveniently leave the city gates wide open. And then these other soldiers that were lying in ambush nearby just rush in and take it over. Or the other method is just to give free booze to the guards of the city until they get drunk and pass out, and then you just climb over the walls and take over the city. That's the only two methods that were used over and over again. And it's just amazing to me. It's like Mormons, in a way, they're kind of like deadheads. You know, like the people that used to go to the Grateful Dead concerts. It's like the music isn't all that great. I mean, the Grateful Dead were not really outstanding rock and rollers. And it is just sort of the atmosphere, the feeling of belonging, of being in these like festival kind of crowds. And the Mormons, I mean, you got some really intelligent Mormons, you know, really brilliant, intelligent Mormons, university educated and everything. And they still believe this Book of Mormon that is just based on this obviously false narrative from start to finish. Like Jesus, after he died, but before he ascended into heaven, he teleported across the Atlantic Ocean into North America and just started like laying waste, killing tens of thousands of people, wiping out entire cities of Lamanites or people that didn't believe in him, you know, in North America. And just because they were bad people. But it's weird that Jesus is flying through the air and just killing tens of thousands of people before ascending up into heaven. It's just so weird. And it's just a little bit more evidence to me, and I keep bumping the table, a little more evidence to me that people can believe anything, and that religion, again, like I mentioned before, it can be a kind of not entirely pernicious mental illness. At least it gets people on the same page. You know, it unifies their worldview. It might be kind of a silly worldview in certain ways, but at least they all believe in it, and it strengthens their community. And I think that's one of the main reasons of religion, at least for mainstream normie types. So Mormonism, I have met some Mormons, and they seem to be relatively moral people. But their Christianity has sort of reverted back more in an Old Testament direction. Sort of like the Jehovah's Witnesses. It seems to me that the Christianity of the Jehovah's Witnesses also is kind of a few steps backward, back in the direction of the Old Testament. So, but yeah, I do think that they're definitely Christians. I mean, Jesus of Nazareth is still their number one guy. But, you know, the Book of Mormon is pretty amazing. I think Joseph Smith was a bit on the hysterical side, and that he composed the Book of Mormon in a state of dissociation. So it's a channeled document, as is the Quran for that matter. Hope I haven't just offended like Islamic fundamentalists by saying that the Quran was channeled and that probably Muhammad was experiencing hysterical dissociation, like Joseph Smith. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Pyramid. And Pyramid says, "Hey Panyo Basa, why do you have to keep making sure if you're recording or not? Is your camera set up really that archaic? Why not just use a webcam and OBS?" Well, I am using a webcam and OBS. It's just that before I started using OBS, I was using like the built-in default video recorder on an Apple computer, which was Photo Booth. It was called Photo Booth. And Photo Booth started glitching on me so that it would look like I was recording. You know, I'd hit the record button and everything. The light would light up and everything. I'd get to the end of like a 2-hour-long Q&A, and the whole thing wouldn't be recorded. And then I'd have to do the whole Q&A over again. In fact, one time I had to do it 3 times in order for it to work. And that was enough. And so I downloaded OBS, but still it's like this. I mean, I wouldn't call it PTSD, but still there's like this experience in the past causing me to be very wary and just make absolutely sure that I really am recording, because before I was using OBS, it happened like at least 3 or 4 times where I think I'm recording and then I had to do the whole thing over again. So I don't really have to keep making sure that I'm recording, but it's just like I got stung enough times in the past that I'm just making sure. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Power. And Power says, have you heard of North Sentinel Island? It's one of the last isolated places on the planet. You were not too far away from it when staying in Burma. Is North Sentinel Island the island where some missionaries went and then they just got disappeared and somebody tried to rescue the missionaries? And there's this video footage of these dark colored guys, more or less naked with spears, like getting ready to kill whoever lands in the skiff. And so they decided they better not bother with it. Just let the missionaries stay dead or something. If that is the same island, I've heard of it because of that event that happened a few years back. And I've probably heard of North Sentinel Island before. But yeah, I mean, it's not really like an important issue in my mind. So it's just something that I've heard of before, but never really never took the initiative to look up the Wikipedia article on it or anything. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, how do you create a... Keep hitting the table. Zenithoid says, how do you create a meditation technique? Well, the way you would create a meditation technique, probably you'd start off following somebody else's meditation technique, and then you would modify it based on your own experience. That's pretty much how I would come across a new meditation technique that worked for me. But I mean, you're not inventing anything new at this point. You know, the best you're doing is reinventing the wheel. If you create your own meditation technique, it's more than likely that lots of people have created essentially the same meditation technique in the past, and you just didn't hear about it, and you just came up with it on your own, reinventing the wheel. So, I mean, once you know how meditation works, you know, what you're trying to do in meditation, like reduce perception without reducing consciousness, then, you know, you can get insights on what might work. You might accidentally just be in a certain state of mind that was like really a kind of a bright, expanded, meditative kind of mind. And then you're like trying to cultivate that through a meditation technique or something. So, yeah, that's one way of creating a meditation technique, is you just happen to accidentally stumble into a certain frame of mind that is something you would like to cultivate. And so then you deliberately try to cultivate that. Otherwise, it's, you're just making modifications on a pre-existing meditation technique. Or you just read about something in a book and you try to copy that, but it wouldn't really be creating something if you're just copying something else. But that's generally my experience on the subject is, you just get ideas, or you experience something, or you're just sort of tinkering with a pre-existing meditation technique that you've already been taught, but for some reason you're not entirely satisfied with it. Maybe the results aren't exactly what you'd like. And so, you modify it, you change things, and it, if you're lucky, it gets better. And then you make more progress with it. So I'll just move on to Zenithoid's next question. Broadly speaking, what are the major differences between the meditation techniques of each dharmic religion? Well, I don't think there really are many major differences between the meditation techniques of each dharmic religion. Mainly, like in Theravada, you've got two main kinds of meditation. You've got samatha, and you've got what is vulgarly called vipassana. In other words, you've got meditation techniques that emphasize samadhi or concentration, and you've got meditation techniques that emphasize sati or mindfulness. And I think that would pretty much be the same for any dharmic religions. I know that the Roman Catholics, like the contemplative orders, like the Discalced Carmelites, they had the same too. I mean, they had like what they called meditation, which is just like visualizing or using a kind of mantra, that kind of a thing. And then they've got higher contemplation, in which, I mean, you're essentially cultivating at least second jhana. You're not thinking anymore. You're just wide awake and not thinking anything. So, I mean, that fits just about any kind of religion, any kind of religious system, because if you're not thinking anything, you're not thinking anything heretical that's opposed to the religion. So either you're cultivating, I mean, you could also include another kind of meditation, which is be cultivating like hypnotic trance states, although that one might be still samadhi. It just wouldn't be sama samadhi or right concentration, but it would still be some kind of concentration doing that. So, I mean, different religious traditions will have different kinds of the lower kind of meditation, where sometimes you're visualizing, sometimes you're using a mantra, sometimes you're like, emphasizing the breath, or you're doing scanning like the Goenka method, that kind of a thing. But once you get up into the higher method, I mean, there's only so many ways you can sit there wide awake without thinking anything. So I'm really no expert on the different meditation techniques of different religions. In fact, even Theravada, there's lots of different schools with lots of different kinds of meditating. And that's even within Burma, not even including Sri Lanka and Thailand and so forth. Just within Burma, there are different teachers who have come across different ways of meditating, and they'll be teaching that to their disciples. And a lot of it is like the third kind, like the cultivating hypnotic, like trance states. But I'm pretty sure that all the meditation would either fit under samatha or vipassana. It'd either be based on samadhi, or like emphasizing samadhi, or emphasizing sati, concentration or mindfulness. But they merge at the higher levels. Like fourth jhana, according to the stock description, is the perfection of mindfulness. So especially at the lower levels, there's just all these different kinds of meditating, even within Theravada Buddhism. But then the higher up you go, the more it all converges to the crystal clear glacier at the peak of the mountain. So that was broadly speaking. I hope that was broadly speaking enough, because I'm moving on to Xenothoid's next question, which is, during a session of meditation on feeling the void, which the meditation teacher referred to as shunya, I had a vision where, after pushing through some feelings of fear, I saw some vaguely tribal-looking symbols and faces move across my vision. I wondered what they were for a moment before they faded away and were replaced by a large singular eye which was glowing orange. I felt no ill will from it, instead only feeling that it was a very powerful and not to be trifled with, the kind of feeling you get when you see a dangerous animal minding its own business. This scared the shit out of me, so I opened my eyes and decided to stop meditating. For the next month, I saw the outline of the eye in the center of my vision whenever I would blink, until it finally faded away completely. What do you think I saw? It definitely felt like a distinct entity, but I wonder if it could just have been completely conjured by my own mind. Okay, that's kind of an interesting story. Getting up to the top, one little thing I'd point out is that you're doing a session of meditation on feeling the void, but the stuff that you explained really wasn't the void. So you may not have been meditating on the void very well, because it was very unvoid-like, the stuff that you were experiencing. And you say here the meditation teacher referred to it as shunya. And I would just point out that in Burma, the word for zero is thonya or sunya. That's the word for zero in Burmese arithmetic. So anyways, the Xenothoid had this vision. And then at first he sees vaguely tribal looking symbols and faces moving across his vision. And then he's wondering what they were, which again wasn't meditating very well. And then they were replaced by a large singular eye, which was glowing orange. And it seemed kind of dangerous, but at least it wasn't messing with him. And What do I think he saw? Well, probably there was some imagination going on. But even the imagination can just translate something else into something that you can perceive and kind of get a handle on with your mind. Like, for example, I might as well just digress. I mean, there's no point in even trying to keep this one short. I might as well just go for it. My father, one time, he was a hardcore alcoholic for decades. He was sort of like the kind of alcoholic that's fairly common in Eastern Europe, but not so common in the West, where he was just fueled on vodka. You know, he'd drink a quart of vodka a day. You never really see him drunk. You never really see him sober. He was just kind of fueled on it. Anyways, he decided that he was going to stop drinking. And alpha macho guy like my father was, he just decided to go cold turkey. So he's alone in the house, sitting at a table, and on the table in front of him, he's got two escape routes if it just gets unbearable. He's got a bottle of booze and a loaded pistol. And he just sits there and he goes through the DTs. You know, he's just like tearing at his hair and hallucinating and just freaking out because he's going through alcohol withdrawal after being a hardcore alcoholic for like 30 years. And during this, he starts seeing this big eye on the wall that's just watching. And he knows that the eye doesn't really care very much about what's going on. I mean, it's just sort of detached. It's just like a detached observer, just watching what's going on, of him just freaking out at this table. And deep down, he knew that that eye was symbolic of like his own like higher self, for lack of a better word. You know, it's like a deep, wiser level of him. They're like the observing mind that's just watching, not getting emotionally involved. He's just there being aware of what's going on. And maybe this orangey colored eye was a version of that for Xenothoid. I'm not entirely sure. But I mean, first, all these vision things that you're seeing, it's mainly an indication that you weren't really meditating on the void very well. And then wondering what they were, I mean, that's just completely off the tracks. So if you'd stayed in the void zone, so to speak, then even if these things started to appear, you just let them go, let them go, let them go. Just don't even worry about it. Don't think about it. Don't wonder what it is. Don't try to interpret it in any way. It's just nature taking its course, so to speak. You just let it happen and let it go. But with regard to the large eye, it could have been like some deeper level, some deeper aspect of your own personality that was like symbolized. That would be my first guess, largely based on my father's experience with his single large eye, except he was seeing it on the wall. I always kind of imagine it as like the eye on top of the pyramid on the back of a $1 bill. So, yeah, I mean, what do I think you saw? I would guess that it's something percolating up from the depths that to some degree your mind symbolized in a way that you could at least somehow be aware of it. But I don't think that there's like the big orange eye floating around looking through windows and that kind of thing, you know, like looking at various people or anything. So, yeah, my best guess is that it was something from like your subconscious mind, possibly like a higher level of your mind that's manifesting itself in a period of relative quiet, you know, when it can sort of make it through to the surface and your mind just sort of symbolizes it in a certain way, maybe distorts it to some degree. And that would be my best guess. But I can't be sure. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, every time when I contemplate the present, it is becoming the past in less than a second. It's like chasing my shadow. Does the present moment really exist? Well, this reminds me of J. Krishnamurti when he's saying, whenever you're perceiving or thinking, you're always dealing with the past. You're never fully in the present. Because if you're using words or any kind of like preconditioned ways of perceiving things, that's all in the past. You're relying upon that in the past to process the present moment. And so, you know, the present moment's gone by the time you've got it into some sort of manageable perceptible state. Also, it reminds me of, I think it's the Diamond Cutter Sutra, where the Diamond Cutter Sutra says essentially, past mind cannot be grasped, future mind cannot be grasped, present mind cannot be grasped. So, the present moment, it would seem logically that it would have to exist because that is the foundation of the perceptions and our feelings and so forth, even though it's constantly changing. And if you're living at the level of perception, then you're never fully in the present moment because you're always relying upon stuff you learned from the past and so forth, memories and that kind of thing to create associations and so forth. So, if you say really exist, then you're dealing with ultimate truth or ultimate reality, in which case it's all present. The power of now. It's just like this one big eternal now. And so dividing time up into past, present, and future is just an artifact of perception. It's not reality. It's more psychology than physics even. But the present moment, you can say that it exists even though it might just be like a geometrical point with no dimensions to it. So that's even more like paradoxical or enigmatic and confusing as hell. And with that, I'm just going to move on to Nature Cure's next question, which is Digha Nikaya Singala Sutta. Actually, it's Sigālovāda Sutta or the Sigālovāda Sutta. I don't know, maybe it could also go by the name Singala Sutta, but generally it goes by the Sigālovāda Sutta. Anyways, the sutta seems profound and good, but in some part it suggests to venerate Brahmins. What is your opinion on authenticity of the Singala Sutta? I'm not sure where it suggests to venerate Brahmins. It might, at the beginning you had, I guess, a Brahmin who was doing his ablutions and then bowing to all the directions and so forth. Then the Buddha taught him a better way of doing it. And then it's a lot of, the Sigālovāda Sutta is one of the main suttas intended for lay people. How to be a good Buddhist lay person. So I'm not exactly sure where the veneration of Brahmins comes in, unless it's just veneration of holy men in general, or just veneration. It could include just paying respect to Brahmins, just because, that's just good manners. I don't think that the Buddha would place any real metaphysical merit on paying respect to Brahmins, other than just it's good to pay respect to, revered elders and that kind of a thing. So the authenticity of the Sigālovāda Sutta, it's really hard to say because, first of all, it's one of the last suttas in the Digha Nikaya. And usually the farther back you go in a body of text like the Digha Nikaya, the less likely it is to be authentic or to have a lot of authentic material in it. Usually the most important, oldest texts are towards the front, usually, or at least you've got a higher concentration of them towards the front. And towards the end of the collection, you've got just sort of like stuff that got added later. But on the other hand, the advice is just basic advice for how to be a good layperson. And so it could be from the Buddha, or it could be added later just based on common sense, just basic Buddhism for lay people. So I really can't say. I forgot to look up G.C. Pandey's take on it. Maybe I should do that in a second. See what G.C. Pandey has to say. Oh yeah, you guys want to do something about it. All right. Ooh, chair leans back. All right, let's see. Early and late in the Samyutta, early and late in the Majjhima. Okay, number 31. Okay, Sutta 31, addressed to the laity and interpreting the 6 quarters Buddhistically, does not contain any marked late features. It may be early. Okay, so that pretty much agrees with me. It could be early, but it's not dealing with anything really radical. It's not dealing with, hardcore ascetics like the earliest texts tended to be directed towards. That is dealing, it's addressing lay people. And so it's not going to be, getting into any weird philosophy or anything. It's just going to be the basics on how to be a good lay person. And so it could be early. There's nothing contraindicating that it's early, but I mean, it's so basic and common sense that it could be early or it could be late just based on common sense. So it's hard to say. And so I'm just going to move on to Nature Cure's third question after I belch a little bit. So he says, Bhikkhu Sujatos having strong feelings or demonstration against use of AI in Sutta translations and on his Sutta Central website. What is your take on this? That is, the use of AI in Sutta translations or Sutta study. Well, you'd have to have a really advanced AI to be able to translate philosophical Pali texts, because there's going to be subtlety in understanding context. Like the word Dhamma can have a whole spectrum of different interpretations. It's not just Dhamma has one English word that translates it. I mean, if that's the way it was, if each Pali word had just one English word, then AI could probably deal with it pretty easily. But if you've got to figure out from the context, how Dhamma is being used, the word Dhamma, for example, or the word Sankhara, which also can have a bunch of different meanings. Lots of Pali words can have various meanings. Then, I mean, how is the AI going to know this? I mean, even using a human to translate Pali text, if he does not understand Dhamma very well, let's say K.R. Norman comes to mind. And I mean, no disrespect to K.R. Norman, but he is a linguist, he's a philologist, and he is not really interested in Buddhist philosophy. And so if he doesn't understand the context, he'll rely on the commentaries maybe, or just use his Oxbridge type common sense to try to come up with a rendering or a translation, and he's not always correct. Partly just because he hasn't lived the life, he hasn't practiced the practice. He's mainly dealing with, Middle Indic Prakrit languages. And so, I mean, he doesn't really care particularly all that much. I mean, one time he wrote to me, I mean, we had a little bit of a correspondence going on, just very briefly. And he was saying he doesn't really care what it means. He just cares what it says. But I mean, you can't know what it's saying if you don't know what it means. Like with regard, how are you going to translate the word Dhamma? I mean, there's so many different ways you could translate the word Dhamma. How are you going to translate it in this context? And so AI, with regard to something really simple, something really straightforward that's not controversial at all, I assume AI would do well. With regard to something where, I mean, you really have to understand Dhamma in order to just use your understanding of Dhamma to interpret what is being said here and having the whole thing in context and everything. I don't think AI is advanced enough to understand that stuff better than, say, K.R. Norman, who is a very talented philologist. So, I mean, I don't have strong feelings, really. I mean, AI might be able to be less biased than some translators, although the AI is going to be as biased as the person who programs it, which is pretty obvious from, some of the snafus of Google's AI and so forth, where, the AI is just spewing leftist talking points, for example. So let's see. What is my take on the use of AI in Sutta translation or Sutta study? I really haven't been exposed to it, so I really can't say. I mean, I haven't seen any of the results of AI's attempts at translating a sutta. It might just be ridiculous, or in some cases, it might actually come up with something insightful, or at least it seems insightful to a human, because we're so stuck in our Western approach of looking at things that, I mean, the obvious is just looking us in the face and we're not seeing it. But then again, as I was saying, AI is going to be as biased as the people who program it. And so you're still not getting around the whole human frailty issue. But Bhikkhu Sujato, he apparently has strong feelings against even me appearing on his Sutta Central. I've been told that any mention of me or any like citing of anything that I've written or anything is just deleted, because I think Bhikkhu Sujato is fairly leftist in his leanings. So he doesn't particularly like people who are like way less leftist than him, like participating on his site or whatever. Not that I've ever put anything on his site myself. I've just heard about this secondhand. So I guess I addressed that, sort of, more or less, maybe, kind of. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting towards the bottom here. We're getting towards the bottom of the sacred scroll. So anyways, the next question is from the proto-pseudo-monk. And the proto-pseudo-monk, as you may know, puts little headings or titles over his questions. And so this one is advice regarding fools and fifth precept. And he says, how must one apply the Buddha's advice on not associating with fools in this day and age? It appears that most people are fools. I no longer meet with my old friends, people I care for and known a long time, as their life revolves around alcohol and generally hedonism. Amongst other things, alcohol is a huge support for delusion, but it is so widespread it's unavoidable in social settings, at least where I live. The fifth precept equals condemning yourself to voluntary social isolation. What I mean is, you are isolating yourself from the rest by not drinking, as you are stopping deluding yourself. The fifth precept, which I have mostly held for 3 years, I find is the biggest determinant on my relationship with society. I feel I am at an existential crossroads of abandoning society to progress in Dhamma, or partaking in society at the cost of delusion. Did this happen to you before you became a monk? Do you have any advice? And I'm just noticing here that the proto-pseudo-monk has asked only one question here, which is causing me to think maybe I forgot to. I mean, he usually asks the maximum number of 3. Maybe I should make a quick check here to see if the proto-pseudo-monk... No, by golly, he only asked one question. All right. It's okay. I'm not mad or anything. Not very. So, there is kind of 2 questions, though. He asked 2 questions in a complex question, because the first question mark is up here at the top, which is, how must one apply the Buddha's advice on not associating with fools in this day and age? Well, it's pretty much the same as in any day and age, because the majority of people are going to be fools. That's just the way it is. I mean, most people are going to be essentially normies that are not particularly spiritually advanced. I mean, everybody's got some depth to them. And sometimes a person who seems to be quite foolish can just come out with this insightful remark that can just have you on the back of your heels. Just, whoa, where'd that come from? So I've had like people that I did not consider to be particularly wise just suddenly just kind of get me out of left field and just say something that struck me as a very perceptive statement. So, I mean, even a hardcore alcoholic or some such does have some wisdom, or in Mahayana's terms, they have Buddha nature. But, yeah, I mean, not associating with fools is blessing number 1 in the Mahamangala Sutta, which is a list of 38 blessings. And numero 1 is Asevana cha balanam, not associating with fools. So, I mean, it's been this way since there's been humans, I'm pretty sure, that most humans are going to be relatively foolish. I mean, you're not going to have an entire society of sages. You might have a small society of sages for a little while, and then it's going to get infiltrated by dorks or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, you have to do it as much as you can. I mean, being polite to people, working alongside of people that are foolish. I mean, in a way, it's helping you to practice, equanimity and metta and compassion and so forth. If you don't just get lost. So, Yeah, I mean, you don't want to, maybe you don't want to be going over to their house, inviting them over to your house. But I mean, to the extent that you're socially obligated to interact with other people, you can interact with just about anybody. I mean, you can interact with a complete criminal who's trying to rip you off, but still you should just be polite, and just, excuse yourself relatively early on in the conversation and make yourself scarce. But getting down to the bottom question mark, though. Oh, there's 3 question marks, so maybe he did ask 3 questions. So he said, did this happen to you before you became a monk? And yeah, it did, because I grew up in Aberdeen, Washington, and if you didn't drink beer, I mean, you just weren't going to amount to anything socially. Like, I went to high school there, and yeah, I mean, the Pacific Northwest, going to college and everything, you don't party. I mean, you just be a dreary nobody with no social life. And so I remember I was in my 20s and I went to Tongpulu Kaba monastery and was ordained for 5 weeks as a samanera, as a novice, just sort of testing the waters, like a dress rehearsal for being a monk, just see if it was going to work. And after I was disrobing, when I was, converting back to a layperson, putting on my layman's clothing again, my preceptor, the abbot there, asked me, will you be able to keep 5 precepts? And I said, probably not, because that was it. I mean, drinking beer with my friends, it's like most of my friends drank alcohol. And I was experimenting a little bit with just being designated driver. But I mean, some of you may know what it's like to be the only sober person in a group. Everybody else is just uproariously, effusively making dumb jokes and laughing and everything. And you're just kind of sitting there thinking, these guys are acting like they're weird or dumb or something. It's like, it's like you're not on the same page with them. You're just essentially just driving them from one bar to the next. So yeah, that didn't work for me. And so really, I didn't really start keeping 5 precepts until I renounced the world. I mean, I was, becoming less and less. I was drinking less and less. Probably I might have gone for several months without drinking before I became a monk. I don't remember now. No, I didn't. No, now I remember. I got drunk just shortly before I went to the monastery. I remember that now. A couple times at least. So in a way, it was just sort of like these last flings before renouncing it for possibly the rest of my life. So yeah, that did happen to me before I became a monk. It's like in Aberdeen, Washington, there's no Buddhist community, or at least there wasn't at the time. So I just had my old high school buddies, my college buddies. Pretty much all of them drank. A few of them were lightweights and didn't drink very much because they'd get drunk off 2 beers. But still, there wasn't very many of those. So yeah, I was in the same kind of situation where, you either stop having friends or, you're going to hang out with drunk people sometimes. So yeah, that happened to me. And I really didn't make the full commitment to Buddhist morality until I became a monk, or was at the monastery anyway. And do I have any advice? Well, gosh. I mean, if you could find new friends that have more of the same kind of goals or attitudes as you, I mean, that would be nice. If you live in a large city, it might be easier. But otherwise, I mean, if you're sort of planning on renouncing the world anyway, then, you're just polite and friendly when you are socially obligated to interact with people. You're not like inviting people over to your house if you know that. I mean, you can invite people over to your house and just not give them anything to drink, I suppose. They might bring their own bottle or something, though. So, yeah, the way I did it is I just continued drinking, although kind of tapering off. I mean, largely it was a social thing. I didn't drink alone. And it's just your old buddies, for old time's sake, you're hanging out with them because I still liked my friends. They're good guys. And yeah, so I drank right up until I went to the monastery, I'm pretty sure. But my advice to you, I mean, I shouldn't give advice like, yeah, don't refrain from drinking alcohol until you actually go to a monastery, which is what I did, I have to admit. And I drink a little bit of alcohol even after I stopped being a monk. So there's that too. So it's hard for me to give advice. I mean, if you can find other friends that share the same kind of aspirations as you or the same attitudes, at least they don't get drunk, then yeah, you could cultivate new friends. Or you can just be like a semi-hermit, like I was largely before I became a monk. I mean, I moved to a town where I knew I didn't know anybody just so I could be more alone. So I've always had sort of a solitary aspect to my personality ever since I was a kid. I don't know how easy that would be for you. So, I mean, just do what seems right, I guess, would be my best advice in this situation. I mean, drinking alcohol really is not just pure evil. Apparently, Jesus of Nazareth drank alcohol. At least he was dipping bread into his wine. He was turning water into wine so other people could get drunk. So, I mean, alcohol in and of itself is not like a horrible evil that's going to send somebody to hell. But of course, if you become an alcoholic or just start drinking alone just to deaden your painful memories or something, that's not good either. So, yeah, I guess this is one that you're pretty much going to have to work out for yourself. Cultivate new friends, or just kind of be polite and maybe not so much engaged with your old friends. Interact with people as much as you're socially obligated to do, and then just be pretty much solitary when you come home from work or whatever. That's largely what I did also. But I mean, so long as your heart feels good about what you're doing, then you're probably doing pretty good. I mean, if your conscience is at ease when you're doing it, you're not doing too bad anyway, assuming that you have a conscience. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the very last question, the very last one. Gosh, we're almost 3 hours now. This is weird. 3 hour long videos. I never thunk it. I never thought I'd do it. And here I am doing it. So anyways, this question is from Arain. And Arain says, when we hit a wall in practice or in personal development, first of all, what does the wall represent? And second, how do we proceed beyond the wall? Okay, that's kind of two questions, isn't it? I just separated them. So when we hit a wall in practice or in personal development, first of all, what does the wall represent? Well, it can represent more than one thing. One thing is, it may be that you're following a limited method. Like you're following a limited meditation method and you just got as far as you can with it. And then, I mean, that's sort of hitting a wall right there. Although what I think is more usual, I mean, it's pretty common to have limited methods, but most people don't meditate well enough or practice well enough to reach the end, to reach maximum level, to be totally maxed out on the level or on the method. And so what is more likely is when you hit a wall, it's like your own subconscious mind just sabotaging your practice. It's like fear of enlightenment because your ego will die, and your ego is like an animal that doesn't want to die, that kind of thing. Or, just letting go of your old habits. It's sort of like letting go of your like aspects of your personality, which is sort of like partial suicide. Too much of a change. It's like part of you is dying because it's getting left behind, that kind of thing. There's all these different ways that your subconscious mind can just like rebel and fight against your practice. Anyone who's gone to a meditation method or a meditation retreat can know just how much your mind can just like fight against like doing proper meditation. Sometimes it's like riding a bucking bronco at a rodeo, just trying to get your mind to just calm the fuck down. So, yeah, it's like our addiction to being unenlightened. It's a myth that we're not enlightened because we're not trying hard enough to become enlightened. I mean, the reality is that we're unenlightened because we want to remain unenlightened, and we're continually trying to remain unenlightened. And so like one aspect, some higher aspect of your conscious mind is like aspiring to become enlightened. And then like the lower aspects of your mind that they've got tenure, they've been there a long time. They're just saying, fuck no, I'm not doing that. And then they'll just start sabotaging just all kinds of weird things, like weird, like psychosomatic symptoms can come up, or else it's just, you just get into the habit of, as soon as you sit down to meditate, your mind just starts spinning off all these weird thoughts. I mean, all kinds of things can happen. So when you hit a wall in practice, like I said, at least what I'm thinking of right now is that either one, you've got a limited method, and you've reached the limits of that method, at least for yourself, or what is probably more common is that your mind is resisting change and it wants to stay the way it is, and it is subconsciously fighting against making progress. So that leads to part 2 of Arian's question, which is, second, how do we proceed beyond the wall? Well, if it's a limited method that is the limiting factor, as they say in biology, then you switch to a better method. You switch to a method that works better for you. And you can try that regardless. I mean, even if your mind is sabotaging your practice, then still switching to a different method might be enough of a shift that, you can start making progress again, maybe up until finally your mind kind of digs in and entrenches itself again and starts fighting back again. So that would be one way, is to switch to a different method. But the other method is you've got to understand yourself. First, it helps to know that your own mind is sabotaging your practice, like your subconscious mind, some level of your mind just isn't on board. You're not 100%. You might be 90% or 80% or 20%. Like 20% of your mind is all for enlightenment, but this 80% is just not on board, and they're going to just like keep throwing monkey wrenches into the works or whatever it is, dragging their feet, and it's just not going to work. So, it reminds me of Schopenhauer, the first philosophical treatise that he wrote, The Fourfold Root of Sufficient Reason, where he's saying that like a certain personality is going to react to the same stimuli in the same way until its perception changes. That if you want to change your behavior when a certain stimulus, impinges on your sensorium, so to speak, then you're going to have to change the way you perceive things. Like somebody might be real cavalier about handling snakes, or there's vipers all around me, I don't care. They get bitten once, and then all of a sudden their attitude's going to be very different. It's like just any kind of dangerous situation, you might be real, so what? It's not going to happen to me, until it happens to you, and then that's going to really change your attitude. So like my father, I bring up my father a lot. He's a good case history. He kept trying to stop smoking. He smoked 2 packs a day of like Marlboro 120s or something. And then he decided, well, he better stop smoking. It's not good for me. So he'd stop smoking. And then after, a few weeks, maybe a month or two, he'll start smoking a pipe every now and then, or like chewing tobacco or something. Within another few weeks, he's right back to 2 packs a day again. And so he just could not bring himself to consistently and finally stop smoking, until one day his legs started turning black. He goes to the doctor. The doctor said that he had injured that leg before, and that there was capillary damage. And so these broken capillaries were clogging up with tar from smoking. And the doctor told him, you're either going to stop smoking, or we're going to have to amputate your leg. And then when it became that choice, when his perception of not smoking anymore was altered by what this doctor told him and his own black leg, all of a sudden it wasn't that hard anymore. I mean, you still had the urges and everything, but it was easy to dismiss the urges. So that's how you proceed beyond the self-sabotage wall, is somehow you've got to change the way you look at things. Because so long as you have the same attitudes, the same perceptions, and you react the same way to the same stimuli, then you're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So you're going to have to change the way you look at things in order to change your stereotypical habitual behavior, which is the limiting factor. Or something like that. And I hope I answered that question. I really do. And that's it. We're done. And so, you guys know the drill. If you got any questions you think maybe I can answer, especially about like Buddhist philosophy, meditation, that sort of thing, spirituality in general, philosophy in general, me personally, Burma, also known as Myanmar, whatever, if you think maybe I can answer it, feel free to ask. And just include it in the comments below this video. Or if you have access to my Subscribe Star, you can ask it there. If you have access to my Discord server, you can ask it there. And look at the URL links below so that you can see my BitChute and Rumble channels if you haven't seen them already, because I really do encourage people to use alternative video platforms, because YouTube is just on a censorious rampage. And I mean, they're just, you know, they're making it clear whose side they're on. It's not my side. So what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, subscribe and like the video if you haven't done it already. I mean, you lasted this long. You lasted 3 hours. So you must have liked it a little bit. And be happy. And I'm going to stop recording now.